Instead of seeing now Egypt and Nubia as two separate entities where they clash at the first cataract and there's conflict, because we're always told from Egyptians that Nubians are wretched, that they were always going into Nubia to dominate Nubia. But actually, we can see that there was a lot of coexistence and cooperation maybe, and a lot of interaction between these two, which leads to a huge amount of complexity. So specifically at Edfu, I've been studying this Nubian-style pottery, or so-called Nubian-style pottery, which occurs in relative abundance in context from the end of the Middle Kingdom to the very start of the 18th dynasty. We also have some from the late Old Kingdom, but today I want to focus on that sort of second intermediate period, early 18th dynasty phase. So is technology really enough to think of these things as Nubian? So I mentioned earlier that there are parallels for this type of pottery at settlement sites all through the Nile Valley, and as you can see, these pink dots mark where this pottery occurs. But it also occurs at sites north of the First Cataract at Elefantina, at Edfu, at El Kab, at Karnak, at Abydos, at Kahun, and a few other places. So given this wide distribution in Egypt, why do we call this stuff Nubian?
Let's look at some images of ancient Egyptians and also talk about the names that ancient Egyptians were given, especially if they were Nubian. So the first one is Nahesi. It's an interesting word for a couple reasons. One, the man standing there, who is thought to be a Nubian, was named Nahesi. The word Nahesi in ancient Egyptian means Nubian. It was also given to a woman later on who was amongst the lower Egyptians near the Sinai region. She is also thought to be a Nubian, though some people have argued that she's a Canaanite. The female version of this word would be Nehesit. Now, interestingly, this word might not refer necessarily to Nubians in general, but also might be a tribe name that then was applied in general to any Nubian. There are many, many words in ancient Egyptian writings that refer to Nubians, and we have no idea in all cases whether they are referring to Nubians as a tribe or Nubians as a people. If we look at this one image, what we will see is that we have this Nubian man, and right next to him, we have his wife. If his wife is Nubian, then it's interesting that she is painted yellow, and it's interesting that she's given the typical long hair that you sometimes see in Egypt. The people around him as well seem to be Nubian because of the darkness of their skin. Now, I want to stress that even though he was given the name Nahesi, it's more like a title, like this person, the Nahesi, meaning almost like if I said this guy, the Egyptian, and I keep calling him Egyptian. It doesn't mean that his name was that. In fact, we know his name. His name comes across as a typical Nubian. It's Nenu. Nenu the Nahesi.
We are going to talk about this object here called the Stela of Nenu, which is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And it is dedicated to a guy named Nenu, who is described as a Nehesi. Nehesi means Nubian, and it's dated to the first intermediate period, which is sort of about 2100 BC-ish. There's a number of stela of the same period in the museum here, which I had a look at today, which was really cool. And on the stela here, Nenu is depicted with his wife, and they are receiving offerings from their children, possibly from attendants also. He's carrying a bow with a quiver of arrows. He's also accompanied by hunting dogs, maybe. So he's
the bow with the quiver of arrows might be a reference to his Nubianness. As we can read here, it says, burial stele of Nubian bowman Nenu, first intermediate period. Now, like I said, it might be a reference to Tasseti symbolically. He might actually be an arrow person. And you notice how he's got this weird thing tied by his waist. That's also a Nubian reference. So this person is referred to as the Nehesi, meaning the Nubian, but then he also has all these Nubian things around him as well.
Presumably an archer. And the important point here is that he's described as a Nehesi, which we know is this generic Egyptian word that we would translate now as Nubian. So let's look at some of the features. So we have here some iconographic features that have denoted or been used to denote Nenu as Nubian. So the first thing we can see is that he is, well, first of all, he's called a Nubian or a Nehesi in the text. He has dark brown skin, which is usually used to, or people usually think of as being something Nubian. He's wearing a sash, which is a Nubian style of dress. He's carrying a bow and arrow, which is something that is also normally associated with Nubians, and also he's accompanied by dogs, which is also something that people think of as associated with Nubian archers and hunters.
The dogs in question are the Basenji. These dogs, of course, come from Central Africa and they are migrated north from Central Africa to Sudan, where the Kordofanian languages are to be found. And from the Kordofanian language, which I will get into another time, they move from the Kordofanian regions, which are half Bantu, half Sudanese, and they move into the Sudanese regions. And from the Sudanese regions, they move into Egypt, which is probably why these dogs, which are called Iwal, are related to the Sudanese people, where we know that some of the Sudanese people were called the Wawat, which we don't know what the name or the origin of it is. We just know that it's Lower Nubia. So to be factual, Lower Nubia back in the day would be Northern Nubia today, which is inside of Egypt. A lot of people associate Nubia with Sudan, but for the most part, when they talk about Nubians, they were talking about people who are located today in Egypt. And yes, they would be associated with dogs because dogs would obviously come from that direction.
But there are also a number of Egyptian features. So the object type itself, a stela, is typically thought of as an Egyptian object, even though there are some types of stela from Nubia from earlier periods. The text is written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. His wife has yellow skin, which generally would be thought of as Egyptian because she's fairer. We won't go into all of the problems of assuming someone's identity because of their skin color. That's a different story.
Because we know that this person is Nubian because of multiple indicators, he is called the Nubian. He's holding a bow, which is typically associated with Tasseti. He's got those dogs from Wawat, and he's got that sash, which I didn't know that's what it was called. There's nothing that would make us assume that his wife is Egyptian, and to assume that she's Egyptian because she's light skinned would be wrong, really. Especially if we consider the fact that his kids are not light skinned. Most of his kids that are portrayed there are dark skinned. What we find is that this is probably the same thing that happened in ancient Egypt. I mean, they do say he's dark here, but let's be honest, he's about the same color as we normally see other ancient Egyptians portrayed. It's just here he is 100% highlighted as a Nubian. His wife, if she is a Nubian, highlights the fact that the yellow skin is probably not factual. It probably has to do with depicting females as divine in some sense, giving them the yellowish glow that gods would get when they are portrayed. As they used to say, yellow is the skin of the gods. Now, it's possible that actually she was actually just lighter in complexion, even if she was Nubian, and that's the end of the story. But I think outside of any other evidence, that would just be making information up, and I'm not a big fan of that. Unfortunately, we don't know anything else about this person. We don't know if he spoke any Nubian languages or if he spoke the ancient Egyptian language. All we know about him is that he's here in Egypt and he is there with his wife, which makes me think what it must have been like for people, especially those Nubians who weren't part of the greater civilization. which I'll get into later, that these people who are Nubians, called Nahesi, is a general term. There were tribes that were naked at the time, and then there are tribes that were fully clothed with sophisticated temples and buildings, and they built some of these stelae inside of their kingdoms as well. You know, even the later ones that would finally put all of Sudan together in order to overwhelm the ancient Egyptians, that would happen. But before that, it was a bunch of tribes. And remember that some of these tribes were in their most tribal state. They were just farmers who had no care about building with buildings. It makes you imagine what it must have been like for them to arrive in Egypt on some kind of mission, being promised prosperity. You arrive in Egypt, you're thinking it's going to be like the rest of Nubia, where there's going to be a big building here and there. There might be some, pyramids. You've probably seen a few of them here and there. But then when you get there, it's nothing but like the biggest pyramid you've ever seen, almost touching the sky. All these giant painted buildings and writings everywhere. It must shock the soul. And remember, we're talking about a time when tribal people would have heard nothing but rumors, not anything sophisticated like watching it on TV, not a drawing, none of that. A drawing, in fact, could not even do justice. I mean, if you look at this picture right here on the screen, some of these jaws are so out of proportion that they seem to be the size of people's heads. So it wouldn't even make sense. You would have to see it. And once you see it, how do you go and explain that when you got there, you saw this triangle coming, almost looking like it's going into the sky, and it's bright white and reflects the sun in certain ways? It's no wonder why we find so many different tribes inside of Egypt. It probably drew a lot of them in, especially after the rumors.
But also the artistic canons. The way that the people are drawn and depicted is following Egyptian style. So the shoulders are drawn frontally, faces in profile, their feet like the walk like an Egyptian type sort of stance. So there's all of these Egyptian features on this object as well. And then we can think about his name first. So we'll think about a few things, but first his name. So his name is Nenu, and we can see that in the detail that I've got here in the box, where it says Nenu the Nehesi. His name is written in Egyptian hieroglyphs, so it is Egyptian, but it's written phonetically, which is not normal for this kind of a name. The word Nenu is spelt in a way that might mean weariness or inertness, which seems like an unusual name to give to a person.
So, of course, for Nenu, the evidence is building, and of course, his name being written oddly, and the fact that his name means something strange in ancient Egyptian, where it wouldn't mean something strange had it been written in a completely different way, tells you the conventional way that the ancient Egyptians would write a name that looks like that, tells you that he must be a foreigner to some degree. Now remember, Nubian doesn't mean racially different than ancient Egyptian, and that's why the indicators are not really skin color. The indicators are not really his height or anything like that. The indicators are cultural things that he's holding and even wearing, and his name.
It would imply that he chose to have himself depicted and described in a certain way, and he wanted himself depicted in a way that is typical for Egyptians. It also implied that he selected the text, and in turn that he was able to speak and perhaps even read Egyptian language. But if we assume the opposite, if we assume that Nenu was Nubian, it suggests that he was maybe bilingual, that he could speak and read Egyptian and Nubian, or not read Nubian because there was no Nubian writing. But maybe he didn't speak Nubian at all. Maybe he's lived in Egypt his whole life and maybe he only spoke Egyptian. So we don't know exactly what was going on there. But
1400 BC, we have another reference to this word under Thutmose I, where he says, their villages to him, kissing the ground, dancing in homage to his majesty, bowing to his Urias after he had overthrown the chief of the Nubians. Then the next phrase, Nahesi Wasser, which is the despoiled Nubians, something his grip, loses his grip. Now, that Wasser word can also mean the brave or anything like that, so it's interesting that they go with despoiled. So what we know here is that the word Nahesi is 100% used for Nubians. As here, he uses a Nubian word, the STJW word, for Nubians, and then he uses Nahesi. Now, that first word, KSW, is not Kush. I know some people are going to see it and think it. It means bowing. It means bowing. It doesn't mean Kush. But in the bottom line, NHSJ is Nahesi. So we can see here that having a man who's a Nubian being called the Nahesi is striking, especially when we can see in multiple places all over Egypt that the word Nahesi is used over and over and over and over and over again to signify Nubians in specific locations, actually. And again, this word Nahesi is not specific in some ways. In other words, it's specific that it's talking about Nubia, but it's not specific about which Nubians. It just generally means Nubians. In this stele, we actually have something very important, which is they use another word referring to Nubians generally, and it's this STJW word. This word can easily be translated to Nubians, and as you can see, it's identical to the other dictionary definition, Nubians, right there at the bottom. So here he's referring to a specific type of Nubians, even though he says Nubians. And how do I know? Because he says, I have overthrown the chief of the Nubians. This means he has overwhelmed one person. And that's the important part, that these Nubians, whether it's a multiple plural or not, refers to a tribe that was under one person's power. But he then refers to them as Nahesi. So it's possible that there was a confederation of Nubians, and he's talking about how he took out those ones specifically. There are actually more words referring to Nubians, which shows that they had a difference between different Nubians. One of the Nubians were the desert dwelling ones. So let's talk about the faraway tribes of Nubia, the ones that we know were pretty far away from Egypt compared to the other ones. And the way we know this is because one of their traits is that their names are typical of Nilo-Saharan names. So the Iram, right, are a tribe of Nubians who are located in the place where we would call Meroe, and over there you might find Kush as well being used. And a lot of these Kushites and these Iram, what they have in common is that it's Sudanic all the way. Now remember that we don't find for a long time a history of names written in Afro-Asiatic outside of ancient Egyptian. But actually there is Sudanic people, or Nubians if you'd like, which are written in Afro-Asiatic. And those are the ones that are not necessarily Kush and not necessarily Iram, where the capital of the Kushites is in Meroe. For now, let's ignore Punt and let's just go straight to the next sentence. So, in Punt, in the eastern desert, full stop, so that's not the important part, based partly on the analysis of phonology of place names and personal names from the relevant regions preserved in ancient texts. He argues that the terms from Kush and Iram, ancient names for Kerma, and the region south of it, respectively, in Egyptian texts, display traits of typical of Eastern Sudanic languages, while those from further north in Lower Nubia and east are more typical of Afro-Asiatic family, noting the Iram list also provides a similar inventory to Kush, placing this firmly in an Eastern Sudanic zone. These Iram Kush lists are distinctive from the Wawat, which we discussed earlier, the Medjay, which are the people who would be associated with police in Egypt, Nubians, which are associated with police in Egypt, Punt. Remember again, Punt is in Somalia, Ethiopia, and then Wetnet list, which provides sounds typical of Afro-Asiatic languages. Couple things that come up when you think about if this person is correct. Remember, this is a hypothesis; it's not necessarily a fact. Theory, I would say, because if you look at it, the original list, which we don't have time to go through it right now, but if you look at the places that they are given, you would expect Afro-Asiatic languages in those regions. Punt being in Somalia and Ethiopia, where Afro-Asiatic languages are still today. That's interesting because it means that there's early evidence of Afro-Asiatic languages from ancient Egypt. That would be very interesting. And of course, there's also Kordofanian with the implications of Bantu languages there. Medjay, which are located in the northern parts of Nubia, Wawat as well. We would expect those. So remember, there's a double separation. And I want to make sure that people understand this. That area, Sudan, is one of the most crowded in languages. There's the Kordofanian break, there's the Niger Congo languages, there's the Sudanic languages, there's Afro-Asiatic languages in that one region at one time, maybe about 2000 BC. Again, I'll talk about the Kordofanian languages another time because it still hasn't been decided exactly if all the Kordofanian languages are related to Niger Congo languages or if they're separate with borrowings. What it means, though, is that clearly there is a bridge between Sudan, Punt, the Bantu regions, the Niger regions, and that area is Sudan, but it doesn't necessarily take away everything. It's interesting how Punt itself is literally, literally an Afro-Asiatic region as it is today, and perhaps it shows the true history that the Afro-Asiatic languages were so deeply embedded in Africa that they could hop from one place to another. I mean, it's kind of crazy to have Sudan have a whole bunch of Nilo-Saharan languages. And there is some thought that the Nilo-Saharan languages represented more of the people that were away from the rivers, and then the Afro-Asiatic might resemble people who were close to the rivers. Now, that's not necessarily true of all of them, as so many of them have been by the rivers, and there's so many. We talk about thousands of years, but at one time it might have represented that, especially since we have Kerma and all these places.
Wider variety of forms, so we have open forms and closed forms, and the decoration is less common. Nubian stuff is far more decorative. But we need to ask ourselves some questions, though. If we divide it simply like that, we've got Egyptian here and Nubian over there, we can put them in different boxes and end of story. But there are some other things we need to think about. So is technology really enough to think of these things as Nubian? So I mentioned earlier that there are parallels for this type of pottery at settlement sites all through the Nile Valley, and as you can see, these pink dots mark where this pottery occurs. But it also occurs at sites north of the First Cataract at Elefantina, at Edfu, at El Kab, at Karnak, at Abydos, at Kahun, and a few other places. So given this wide distribution in Egypt, why do we call this stuff Nubian? And one thing we consider is where the vessels were produced. Now, unfortunately, we're not able to do things like
Our giveaway is pottery. We know that pottery was invented and then shipped all around the areas, and so we can tell that the Egyptians had moved some of their pottery down to Egypt and some of the Nubian pottery up into the highest parts of Egypt and possibly into Asia, but for the most part they stayed in Egypt, and for the most part the Egyptian pottery stayed in Nubia. And so we know that, but we know also that the other Nubians built pottery exactly the same. The other Sudanese people built pottery exactly the same as the Nubians. And you see this in Meroe, and you see it all over the place. Now remember, the potter's wheel had been invented a long time ago, and that is the one thing that separates a lot of Nubian art or Nubian pottery from Egyptian pottery, that they used the potter's wheel. Whereas in Africa, and this is the whole Africa, they used their hands and had various methods, like this method here of using the black top to dry it so that it can keep its shape and everything else like that. So these very technical and skilled people seem to have everything in common with the rest of Africa more than anybody can really say. It's not even known how deep their connection is, especially with the Kordofanians right here in the corner. So let's see the criteria that he gives for Nubian versus Egyptian. Handmade, no turning wheel, red exterior, black interior, black tops, fired at low temperatures, fabric black, soft and crumbly, predominantly bowl forms, incised decorations. And the Egyptian, mostly made of the turning wheel, lighter colored surfaces, fired at higher temperature, fabric well oxidized, well variety of open and closed forms, and decoration less uncommon. Actually, I think that's a mistake because he said decoration less common. He means uncommon. Decoration less, comma, uncommon. So that part kind of confused me, but yeah, he's saying that the Egyptians typically didn't decorate their pottery as much as the Nubians did.
forms, so we have open forms and closed forms, and the decoration is less common. Nubian stuff is far more decorative.
If we look at other people from other places, like these women located uh, to the south of the Nubian regions, all the way down to Ethiopia and places like that, we can see that their pottery uses both the Egyptian and the Nubian. As you can see, some of them are black topped with red bodies, and some of them, obviously, it's not black topped, but it's got the still got the black around it, and it's got this closed gourd thing that he's talking about that the Egyptians did, whereas the Nubians tended to have like dish-like pottery, where their pottery is like fully open. Now, some people always get triggered when I say Afroasiatic. Afroasiatic, as you can see, can mean fully black. Of course, there's other pieces of land located in Africa which we don't know exactly where they are, but we know that they're in the direction of Africa, and this is one of them, probably pronounced ill, and it is somewhere in Africa. That's why it's written a location on Africa, and it's in the region of the Nubians, but it's not necessarily the people that they would call the Nubians. Possibly it could be one of the other Afroasiatic tribes, or even further than that, representing the Niger Kordofanian languages. Now, before you go around saying that these were the actual names of these places, remember that these words come from the ancient Egyptians, which means they might not represent fully the local languages and what the words meant. Just like how, even close neighbors, like how some people, in Africa, a tribe will be right next to you, and you'll have your own name for them. For example, the Khoisan in South African languages before the white people got there were called Umtwa, but that's not their name. And any name that is not related to the original language can't be the name that they gave themselves. And of course, if we look at other names like Xhosa, which is believed to come from the Khoikhoi word for angry man. And, we find so many words that are made up but might not represent fully the words used by those people. And if we can see that in our modern world, in tribes in our modern world, there is very little hope that it didn't happen in the ancient past. Now, there's some that we obviously know come from outside and have nothing to do, words that have nothing to do with tribal names. Next time, we should probably look at Libyan words. For example, what words did people use in ancient Egypt to describe specific tribes in Libya? And are there any tribes that relate to those words today where you look at the word, you go, yes, that makes sense? Now, keep in mind, there's that guy who had that one theory, which I agree with, that half of the people have names that are Afro-Asiatic place names and stuff like that, and then the other had place names that were Sudanic or Nilo-Saharan in origin. This means that it is possible that a lot of those words did come from the natives. So this one people will be very familiar with, but like I said, this one doesn't really represent the ancient Egyptians. But you can see that Libyans had their own words. We will return with the Libyans because we have people like the Shashe, which are Libyans, Libyan tribe that is mentioned, and so many other names. And we will see if they fit into the Afro-Asiatic branch, or are they Libyans living in Libya who speak Nilo-Saharan languages. That would be very interesting if they did, because it would mean that the branch that goes from Afro-Asiatic to Nilo-Saharan is not a smooth one. I know I only used one Nahesi, and which means I used only one Nubian spoken of in person, but this was a general understanding that Nubians were well known in Egypt and they came in various varieties, and they came as far as Meroe, deep in the past 3000 BC, and they were known to visit Egypt and work there and then return home. And sometimes we know that even Egyptians would go and live in Nubia or live in Meroe, Sudan. There's a lot of evidence of that. The earliest pharaoh Nama, who had once fused Egypt, did a good job, only to have his job fractured. In the first intermediate period, the Egyptians scattered and different kingdoms started to arise. Egypt was still seen as a whole, but different factions were held by different people. These nomes would be held by several people and be reunified by this man on the screen, Mentuhotep the second. But what kind of person would let slip of such a great opportunity? What type of person made Egypt slip so far that it fractured this badly and had to be united by this man? Not only did that pharaoh slip up, but it is thought that Mentuhotep is actually a Nubian. He was not the only Nubian who held a giant part of Egypt, as Mentuhotep is written in some of his steles that he defeated some Nubians in Upper Egypt and he took over their kingdoms, reuniting Egypt. Something's a little different as well about Mentuhotep. As you can see here, he is only wearing the red crown. This supposed Nubian would in the future wear a white crown, showing that he had taken victories over all the parts of Egypt, unifying them and becoming the restorer of Egypt. As the restorer of Egypt, he should probably be a little more well known than he already is. If you think about it, he did what Narmer did, but at a later period when technologies had developed, when fracturing had been known to the people, and when other people knew that the target was to reunify Egypt. But again, who is the king that under his rule all of this would fall prior to Mentuhotep taking over? Pepi is the last unified pharaoh before the first intermediate period, which is the period when the Egyptians became fractured. The reason for this, for me, is not as clear, but it's pretty obvious that after he was in charge, things go into dismay. And even King's List don't know or don't agree who would be the next pharaoh after him because of this deep separation. Now, if you remember, this is the same Pharaoh who sent one of his visors deep into the Nubian regions and even lower than the Nubian regions to go find a pygmy. And then he brought the pygmy back, and basically, that's him. Now, given how strange he is as a person and how he would call people from different regions for small ceremonies, it's quite clear that he maybe wasn't as sound as people portray him, or maybe he was as people portray him, because a lot of people portray him as slightly off, and then they say things like, "Did you know?" That's why I notice a lot of the "Did you know" videos. Did you know that pharaohs, when this guy is an exception, because he was kind of a out of it ruler. Now, I'm not saying he was crazy, but he was crazy enough to lose Egypt. But after that, it seems like the ancient Egyptians came back to their senses. But this time, it seems like they had a much more stronger Nubian influence than they did before. For example, these are some of the people who are most important under the ancient Egyptians. This is Mati, the gatekeeper. It seems to me that he is a Nubian. And not only that, he is seen or he is written as a very, very important person to Mentuhotep II. Though Mentuhotep II dealt with the Nubians, he actually dealt with them at a later date, seeing them as Egyptian enough to wait until they consolidated their own power before he took them over. the the enemy that he really wanted to get rid of first were people pouring in from Asia, and he captured these places and pushed them back. Now remember, this is 4,000 years ago, 2000 BC. But Nubia was not standing still, and Nubia was not united either. Nubia had a problem. Now we have to keep some things in mind. The word Kush is actually, at least it seems, that it's older than the word Nubia. And so Kush had this stele. This is the stele of Gemi. The stele of Gemi is of a Nubian king who brags about how he captured, and this is what they say in the translation, enslaved some of the Upper Nubians, meaning that he took over Nubia and captured it during the intermediate period, meaning this is before Mentuhotep became in charge. And so it kind of made it easier for Mentuhotep when you have to get rid of only one power instead of getting it through these other fractioned places. These Nubians clearly, as you can see here, were literate in ancient Egyptian. If you actually check, there are some things there that give it away that he's Nubian, but this Nubian man was well in charge. Interestingly, you can find a bunch of kings from this intermediate period because, of course, they were severed. There were many different kings all over the place, and it's unknown exactly who would be considered the most legitimate one at the time, who came from the descendants or the real line of the ancient Egyptians. Because, of course, there's a difference between taking over Egypt and then being born of royal blood. We can say also that this first intermediate period did sort of play a role in making sure that the long line of unbroken blood was broken. And so we do not expect the kings of this period to be genetically related family wise to the people before that. This, of course, continues, and we see it happening in the time of Ramses II, and we see it happening after that with so many other people. Like, that's why Tutankhamun and Ramses do not have the same family members, but seem to come from two completely different family structures. We need to explore this word Kush because, of course, it is the true word for the ancient Nubians. Now, Nubia has taken over as a word, but it was not as old and was not as common as the word Kush. The word Kush, of course, means something completely different to Nubia because, of course, Nubia denotes it as a land of gold. The word Kush, referring more specifically to the region, is adopted and is seen used way later, even after the Nubian word had been picked up. I, Hatre, son of Krampe, Per Kush, the word Per means the, and then Kush means Kush. So Per Kush, and David write to Presbyterus, son of Paula, that I acknowledge that I owe you cataract gold which I received from you for my need. These now in the ill of God, I am ready to give back to you in poem, without any disputing words. I created this ostracan on 20 of dot 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 Thoth in the year dot dot dot. This ostracan was found in Elephantine, and it is representing the Nubian who owes money to an Egyptian, and he pays the money back, or at least he is promising that he is ready to pay the money without any trouble. This person, of course, is referring to someone else, talking to two different people in this story. But let's examine the importance of how we know that it's a later. First of all, he talks of one God rather than many, meaning that he is a Jew or a Christian, one of the two. And then, secondly, he talks of a man named David. David, of course, being a Jewish name or a Hebrew name. Given how easy it is to say the word Cush, it's almost a tragedy that the word, which is probably easy to remember and also easy to write in both English and in ancient Egyptian, that it's being replaced by the word Nubia simply because the Greeks took favor to the word. I think we should bring Kush back, and I think we should bring it back stronger than it's ever been. I'll try my best, obviously, to refer to it. Almost annoyingly, the images that majority dominate the Nubian portrayal are these with these cheetah prints on them. The one thing about it that is annoying is that it does not fully capture the people of Kush, because the people of Kush had several different types of clothing, and one of them, of course, as we read in the other inscriptions long time ago, cotton and linen and all of those were made and even their seeds are early found in the Kush areas before they are found in Egypt. And so this portrayal, though again is seen later, but it's mainly to do with various tribes that get dominated. Again, all of Kush is not the same, even though the word Kush more refers to a consolidation of power, but all of Kush is not the same. And one of the best images we see of this is of a Kushite woman in the time of Mentuhotep being portrayed with proper Kushite clothing, which turns to Africa. There's this weird thing where people say at the bottom of Kush, there is this huge turn to Africa where you see that even though Egypt was on the slope or it was on the side of Asia, Kush was so deep in Africa that its other trends are obvious in Kush. This girl from the time of Mentuhotep the second, which I'll mention something else about Mentuhotep because we're talking about the push deep down, comes from a Nubian woman, and this item was captured by one of the Egyptians and sent back to Egypt. As you can see, it portrays these zigzag patterns, which again point directly to Africa. Not only do they point in that direction, but it seems like the Kushites had direct communication with other Africans. As we will see, the people of Punt are communicated with a long time ago in Egypt. But it seems like the people of Punt had direct communication with the people of Kush, or the lowest people of Kush, meaning the people geographically who would be closer to them. So we're talking maybe all the way down to the Meroitic regions. Those people had direct communication with the people of Kush. And in Kush, we hear years later, years after Mentuhotep, that there is great standings there. Now, Mentuhotep, like I said, was not an idiot. He was happy about his victory and he had conquered, but he did send expeditions far into Punt. And in fact, some of the earliest ideas of what Punt is comes from some early reliefs of Mentuhotep where they portray it as some land where it's prosperous. And of course, we find so many other people. Like there is a pharaoh who came back with a Negro, not a Negro pygmy as the other one, but he came back with a Negro slave from the land of Punt. Now let's think about what that means for a second. So the land of Punt is obviously in Somalia or somewhere in Ethiopia, but let's say Somalia because of the ocean element that is thrown there. Somalia, but there's two other places which some have thrown out there. One of them being Yemen and the other one being Oman. And the reason why I want to talk about this is because it specifically says that they came back with a Negro, meaning they used the word Kush, but in this sense, they use the word Kush to denote that he's a Negro. So this person was not of Kush, but he was like the people of Kush. So if this place is in Oman or if it's in Yemen, that would mean that would be one of the earliest evidences of a Negro in Asia, given that it's, well, the time that I'm talking about is about 1500 BC. So that would be then. But given I don't think it's in Yemen or in Oman. I will say that I don't completely cut off Asia from Africa. So Yemen to me could be a easy place not to be Punt, but to be connected to a kingdom in Punt. So let's say Somalia to some degree had some deep influence even in 1500 BC with the people in Yemen at that time. But that's a story for another day. Let's focus first on Nubia again. If we try our best, of course, to move and understand timelines, let's go back to the Pangrave artifacts. So the Pangrave artifacts are about 1850 BC, going on for another few hundred years. Now, what's important here is that Mentuhotep's reign predates this. I'll say that again. Mentuhotep's reign predates this. This, the Pangraves and all of that, being found in Egypt proper and not just in the Nubian areas or the Kushite areas, might be of that early scramble that happened during the time of Amenhotep III. This is hundreds of years later. We do see some reason to believe that some Nubians are in the Libyan areas. And let's read this so that we can get a clue about what I'm talking about. Utterance of Amun, king of gods, my son, of my body, my beloved Nibmare, my living image, whom my limbs created, whom Mut, mistress of Ishiru in Thebes, bore to me, mistress of the nine bows, who brought thee up as sole lord of the people. My heart greatly rejoices when I see thy beauty. I work a wonder for thy majesty, and thou renewest youth according as I have set thee as the son of the two lands. When I turn my face to the south, so this is facing Cush, I work a wonder for thee. I cause the chiefs of Cush, the wretched, to turn to thee, bearing all the tributes upon their backs. Don't need to explain that. Very simple. He's talking about if I look to the south, what I see is Cushites, meaning everybody to the south is Cushites. Every single group that is there is Cushite. Even the word punt I have seen being used interchangeably with the word Cush, but will return. When I turn my face to the north, I work a wonder for thee. I cause the countries of the ends of Asia to come to thee, bearing all the tributes upon their backs. Again, we're talking about Asia and how he looks towards Asia and they bring the gifts from that side and blah, blah, blah. They present themselves to thee with their children in order that thou mayest give to them the breath of life. Now, keep in mind, Asia here only represents the northern parts of Asia. So it's not representing Saudi Arabia or Yemen or Oman or any of those regions. But this is the interesting part.
When I turn my face to the west, Libya, I work a wonder for thee. I cause thee to seize the Tehenu, so that there is no remnant of them. Meaning that these people have pretty much fled, and it doesn't matter because these fleeing people probably fled because they were nomadic, and so it doesn't matter if the people come and attack that specific region. The Nubians are stuck in Nubia, or the Kushites are stuck in Kush, so they face Egypt and they have to um, give offerings in order to keep life. The people of Asia, when conquered, they have to bring offerings to give life because they're not just going to run away from their homelands. But the people of Tehenu, they flee. But here's the interesting part: they are building in this fortress in the name of my majesty, surrounded with a great wall reaching to the heaven, settled with the children of the chiefs of the Nubian troglodytes or the Cushites. The Nubian troglodytes is how they translate it, but it's the Cushites located in Libya. Remember, Nubian troglodytes, the reason why they give that is because, well, there's a reference to Cushites in this area, so they call them Nubian troglodytes because that's the group. Troglodytes is the group of Ethiopians that have been located by the Greeks later. So in that area of Libya, the children of the Nubian troglodytes or the Kush located in Libya are the ones who are building this wall. And then you see this one. This one has to do with the area known as Saudi Arabia, maybe even Yemen, and maybe Oman. So notice how it's separated in this part, Asia and the Orient, which they did that on purpose, but you will see what I mean. When I turn my face to the Orient, I work a wonder for thee. I cause to come to thee the countries of Punt. Now I want you to think about what is just said. So the word that is used here in the Orient is the word east. So in the West, the Tehenu, right? And they're in the West, the Tehenu, who are the Libyans, and what you have there are Nubians or Kushite chiefs building the walls there. In other words, the people living there in Libya who are forced or have to build a wall there, a fortress for the king, are the sons or the children of the Nubians or the Kushites. To the east, which starting with Punt, when I turn my face to the Orient, when I turn my face to the east, not counting Asia, you already talked about Asia. Asia is to the north. When I turn my face to the Orient, I work a wonder for thee. I cause to come to thee the countries of Punt. So obviously, let's look at a map so we can tell here. So considering these words while looking at this map, okay, to the west we see Libya, and in Libya they say that Kushite, the Kushite chiefs set up a wall there made by the king. And then it says to the north, which of course, when we go north, we're talking about Israel, Syria, Iraq, those places. He says these people, they've been conquered, and they, in order to remain alive, they bring offerings to Egypt. Then he says to the south, the Cushites are in control there, and they bring him offerings and they descend south, right? But then he says to the east, which these guys convert that word to the Orient, which of course is Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and look down there, Somalia, right at the bottom of the screen, Somalia. There is an obvious reason why Somalia is included, perhaps even Ethiopia is included in the east rather than the south, even though I've seen the word Punt being used interchangeably with the word Kush, which I'll talk about in another episode. We can see here that this is why they say this. And he says, when I turn my face to the Orient or to the East, I work a wonder for thee. I cause to come to thee, I cause to come to Egypt, the countries of Punt. So think about it. When looking to the East, not only is he capable of going far, which is given here, I work a wonder of thee, I cause to come to thee the countries of Punt. So deep down here in Somalia, he causes them to, I guess, give offerings or even sail to Egypt, the people of Punt. Now again, we're going to talk about Punt in another video. Hopefully I can get it to be an hour, because we need more information in one video instead of me breaking it apart into 10 videos. But let's let's consider again what I said. Let's say Punt is in Yemen. Remember that there is documents by other pharaohs documenting that they fetched Cushite men, which is translated as Negroes, Cushite men from the kingdom of Punt. Meaning, if it's in Yemen, then it doesn't matter, but we're talking about Yemen with black people. Again, that would completely change the history of Yemen given how long time ago some of these documents are.
So let's go back when we talk about the Nubians. Let's go back, or the Kushites. Let's go back before Mentuhotep, right? This is the last thing we're going to look at. So these vessels, though representing after Mentuhotep, they were built, these, not these ones specifically, but this type was built prior to Mentuhotep. And Pepi the Second here, who was that king who broke everything apart, and some Nubians got standing in parts of Egypt. This person here was preceded by an important king, Pepi the First. And during Pepi the First's reign, what do we see? Well, we see reference to the Medjay. Reference to the Medjay from Pepi the First is in an autobiography, and we will see it writing down several types of Nubians being mentioned prior to Mentuhotep. Now remember, at this period, the Egyptians were in charge of the entire region. They were in charge of most of the Nubians and were solidified as one kingdom until obviously Pepi II broke it apart. So, as we read in the autobiography of Weni, it says, His Majesty sent me to excavate 5 canals in Upper Egypt, and to build 3 boats, and 4 boats of acacia wood of Wawat, Wawat being the name of the people. That's one type of Nubian. Then the foreign chiefs of Irjet, Wawat, Yam, and Meja. So these are Nubian tribes that have been listed. Drew the timber for me. I did it all in 1 year. Floated them. Okay, let's pause for a second because this is an important part as well when it comes to the building of pyramids. And a lot of people, they say, oh, where's the evidence of the ancient Egyptians saying they built the pyramids? This is, remember, this is the 6th dynasty, meaning this is early. Now, keep in mind, so, and remember, people always say that ancient Egyptians got wood from Asia. This is evidence that they also got it from Nubia. Okay, so let's read again. His Majesty sent me to excavate 5 canals in Upper Egypt and to build 3 boats and 4 boats of acacia wood of Wawat. Then the foreign chiefs of Irjet, Wawat, Yam, and Meja drew the timber for them. I did it all in 1 year. Floated. They were loaded with very large granite blocks for the pyramid. Mernere appears in splendor. Indeed, I made a saving for the palace with all these 5 canals. I don't even know. This should be a video on its own, but I'll talk about it another day. But let's, again, I want to read it, but this time I want to break it down. His Majesty sent me to excavate 5 canals in Upper Egypt and to build 3 boats and 4 boats of acacia wood of Wawat. Then the foreign chiefs of Egypt, Wawat, Yam, and Meja, which it is important to break that down, that he considers these people, even though they're in Upper Egypt, he considers them foreign, the foreign chiefs, drew the timber for them. I did it all in 1 year. That's the important part. That everything that he's about to describe is work. He did it in 1 year, which is a pretty long time if you think about it. But it's still done in a single year, meaning it didn't take him 500 years, as some people claim. Floated, they were loaded with very large granite blocks for the pyramid. So, in other words, the way that the wood was transported was probably through water, Nile, Merinre appears in splendor. Indeed, I am saving for the palace with all these 5 canals. So this is one of the earliest mentions of Nubians working hand in hand with ancient Egyptians. And not only are they working hand in hand, they're working hand in hand to complete an Egyptian task. And we see granite blocks, we see wood, we see all of these things coming into play. But also, we see the word foreign being used there to separate that these people are not necessarily Egyptian in the same way that the Egyptians see themselves. And again, the word chiefs is probably an important word. Chiefs, king, whatever. But we see that the chiefs, meaning they are in power. Even when he took over the side of the other side where he took over the west and the Nubian troglodytes were in charge. Notice that he said chiefs. They were still in charge of themselves, so they created a province of their own. This is the important part. The Nubians are not apart from the ancient Egyptians, not in a real way. And we can see here that not only are they not apart, but they are a mainstay in those regions. We find buildings and writings that go back thousands of years, but of course, we find Nubians located very close to Egypt who have no writing, who just accept the ancient way of living, bringing up another point that I've said before in Africa, where in Africa there used to be no force for you to live in civilization. You could live right next to and be tribal and be hunter gatherers and be nomadic and be anything like that. If you look at kingdoms all over Africa, when they get power, when they surround these areas, they let people live the way they want to live. It's not converting them into civilized men. And in this case, the ancient Egyptians, they do that, but they also have this problem where in times of war, they will refer to them as wretched because of the probable lack of, what's the word I'm looking for? Lack of civilization in some areas. And so they'll refer to them as wretched. But again, this is just guessing because we don't know why they actually refer to the people as wretched. At least we don't understand fully. So, in conclusion, though Mentuhotep resembles a very early encounter with Nubians, he doesn't represent the earliest, he doesn't represent the most expansive, and he doesn't represent the best illustration of these people, as just after his death, we see new types of Nubians or Kushites forming right under the Egyptians in a tribal way, just like the Pangrave people. But he does represent a unification. He represents the start of something new in Egypt that would then take off until the second intermediate period. If this is true, and this Nubian and his dynasty are really part of that, then one thing we should separate is this idea that Nubian means the black areas and the other one means the next to black or anything like that. What we should join together is that the Kushite regions is more about place. Just like how you notice how in that story, that tale, he says, when I look to the north, I see Asians. When I look to the east, I see these people. When I look to the south, I see these people. When I look this way, I see these people. It's not about race as much as it is about direction, which will bring me to that thing about an Abu man living in the south in that tale of Senahi, which is why I don't understand why they throw race in there. You'll almost notice that they never say the word race, except when using the word chem. In some cases, they use the word chem to describe some people as dark skinned. Tasseti means the land of the bow, but we all know that bows existed in Egypt and other places around Africa. So why exactly was this place located as the land of the bow? It's because of their reputation. Apparently, their skill was beyond that of any other person in the world, including places in Asia where the skills of the bow were being perfected over and over again. Now, we tend to think that this was something to do with the ancient world. It died with the ancient world, and then in the more modern world, people just forgot about that and they continued to be Nubian in a completely different way. Now, there are several kingdoms that existed within the region, and possibly the oldest one that is related to the ancient Egyptians directly, and even referred to by the Muslims as living the way that ancient Egyptians lived, was the Beja. But let's ignore those for a second and talk about the kingdom of Nubia and why some of the people who lived much later said that this kingdom had people who had bow and arrows so accurate that they could pinpoint any target. But I want to start with this person here who is holding the bow. And the reason why it's important to have this person be in the frame is because it's obvious that it's not one side of the Nubians that are skilled with the bow, but instead the entire Nubians seem to have this reputation. Later on, we would see other depictions of bowmen precisely from Nubia doing exactly what they did. They're so good that, of course, again, the Medjay were employed as police people to guard the desert lands and some of the inlands for the ancient Egyptians, given how talented they were with their weapons. During Ramses II's time, there is something very interesting about the depiction of Ramses II. The first is clearly he is learning from his enemies and he uses a lot of their weapons. The cart from Asia, the horse drawn cart, and the bow from Nubia. But something people don't realize is that a lot of Nubians were actually working with him, charging other Nubians. It's possible that some of the Nubians, especially those not falling over carrying the bow in this image, are actually on the side of the Egyptians. It's actually possible that this is not fully depicting the crushing of all the Nubians, but a crushing where they marshaled the Nubians against each other because the other Nubians represented the Egyptians in some way. If you notice, there are some who are tossed over, some running for their life, and then you also notice some look very comfortable holding their bows in their hand and traveling, some even looking like, oh, look at that, it's Ramses. Another reference to the bow is also made when he is holding this bow, this image, usually of the Egyptian crushing the enemy of Egypt, usually does not include a bow. But in this case, it does, and it might just be a symbol of the people of the land of the bow. Now, why would I say that some of those Nubians were probably on the side of Ramses? Well, let's take a picture, or let's take a look at this picture of Tutankhamun crushing the enemies from Nubia. You will notice a couple things that's going on here. While all the people that are being crushed are from Nubia, you will see that there are some Egyptians inlaid in this who are lighter brown, like a very lighter brown, and they are stabbing and going through. So the people that are being crushed are the people falling over holding their cowhide shields, and they're being crushed under the wheels and stuff like that. But if you look just behind Tutankhamun, you can see that there's three Nubians who are fanning him. And in order to be fanning him, they'd have to be on his side. And then behind him would be other people who are marshaled, probably Egyptians, based on how they're dressed and the color that they're given. And to show that it's not a purely Nubian thing, we can see here that the Asiatics, their bodies have been scattered and really piled together. But you can see right at the top, there's an Egyptian holding a shield, and he is perfectly fine. Then you can see every other person. So inside, there are some people who are Egyptian, but they're not being destroyed. And you can kind of tell because of their shields, which are also kind of hides. But you can see behind the pharaoh that you have the same two Nubians fanning him. Now, it made sense in the previous one that there were Nubians, because of course they were marshaled against the Nubians. If we were going to assume that the reason why they're Nubians is because they're going against Nubians, so they want to show complete submission, well, in this case, it doesn't make any sense because the people who they're charging against are the Asiatics. Now, of course, I understand the problem with saying that the lighter skinned ones are Egyptians and the darker skinned ones are Nubians, but I'm trying to make it very simple in this case. Now, what you notice in those other images is that the ancient Egyptians are standing erect and they are holding their weapon at the enemy. Is it possible that in this image, the people, the Nubians that are standing erect and holding their weapons, they haven't given them up? Is it possible that they're actually on the side of the ancient Egyptians? And even the way they're facing, I mean, most of them are facing towards that direction, except a few. Now, again, I might be fully mistaken and they might all just be running away, but it seems like they're way too comfortable, especially when I compare this image to all other images of crushings where this type of image, which is very glorious indeed, it only shows people being thrown around and the enemy and then everybody else looking kind of comfortable when they're on the side of the pharaoh. So it's possible that what we're looking here is at Tasseti people, people of the bow, who have been used in the armies of the ancient Egyptians, and their usefulness is very prominent in this image, if it's true. Couple problems though. They're not dressed like Egyptians, so that might be an indicator that they're actually just the enemy. And of course, there is writing that goes along with this, which, we have to look into that before we make any real assumptions. If this is true, then we are looking at a fusion of weapons. The bow, perfectly made for the type of chariot that he rides, probably using Nubian tactics, marshaling Nubian men who, if you notice their bows, they sort of look the same as the one that he's holding. They don't look very different. And then, secondly, the chariot and the horse. This image looks very Egyptian, but at this time, it actually is probably slightly foreign. And it must be from this time that this image is really set as a pure Egyptian image, because of course the chariot and the horse didn't exist for a long time within Egypt. Bow and arrows, of course, existed all over the place, but the thing that is different is that Egypt didn't call itself Tasseti. It didn't call every part of Egypt Tasseti. It called Tasseti Tasseti. While there are no bows and arrows in this image, we know that these people are warriors, and the person standing at the back is a Nubian. Now, don't get alarmed that his skin color is exactly the same as the rest of the Egyptians, and only the hair of the Nubian seems to be different than that of the Egyptians. The only thing that really matters is that it's proof that Nubians, especially Medjay, would be in charge of some trips when it came to war and tactics for the ancient Egyptians. And in this case, we see him almost look like he is the captain of the Egyptians. More images of Nubians carrying bow and arrows. As you can see, the arrow that are carried are plenty in their hand, and then they carrying the bow. More proof, and of course they're wearing that tie thing around their waist that you see in so many other depictions of Nubians. And they've got the typical Nubian hair, which you also see. This is why I wonder sometimes why they don't assume all of those guys are Nubian. As you can see, they look slightly similar. Now, of course, the giveaway might be, and this is the point of the video anyway, the giveaway might be that the Egyptians are carrying smaller weapons, close combat weapons, and the Nubians, because they're gifted in the art of the bow, are the ones who are charging with bow and arrows. Now, do we have any real answer, or do we have any real evidence that these people were good with the bow outside of ancient Egypt, outside of the ancient Greeks who were just writing about what the ancient Egyptians said? And of course, they had personal experience with the bowmen in ancient Egypt. We also have that evidence in the 800s AD in the form of a Muslim writer who talks about a specific encounter. So before I go back to the Greeks and the ancient Egyptians, let's read that encounter. So, first, in the very early days, we see that the Muslims were going against the Nubian just converted Christians. And this is what one of the Muslims had to say. The nature and the number of early Muslim attacks is not clear from the Arabic accounts. There were probably at least two major campaigns, one in 641 and the other in 651. The first campaign was met with stout resistance from the famous Nubian bowmen. Okay, now this is what the Muslim has to say. The first part was just prefacing his statement. A Hammerite elder who claims to have participated in two expeditions against the Nubians in the time of Amir B. al-As relates. Okay, here we go. Quote unquote. There were no warriors as brave as they are. I saw one of them asking a Muslim, in which part of your body do you want me to put my arrow? Remember, this is during a war, and this Nubian looks at a Muslim from Egypt and says, which part of your body do you want me to hit? And confidently, the Muslim says, because he knows that arrows have limits, so he confidently points to a part of body. And when the Muslim shows him a certain spot, he would not miss it. Indeed, the resistance was so strong and the booty was so meager that the Muslims asked Amir B. al-As to make peace. Amir rejected the idea, and the Arabs continued their campaign until 651, when Abd Allah bin, the governor of Egypt, marched with his force of 5,000 as far as Dongola. In the ensuing battles between the Arabs and the Nubians, The latter exhibited the same gallant fighting powers and were only scared by the catapults which bombarded their cathedral. The presence of this strange siege weapon prompted the Nubian king Calais to ask for peace, having failed to defeat their enemies. So even though they were taken over, even though they were defeated, they were still championed for their weapon. Now, I could have read it from his book, but it's still written in the Islamic religion. But I will say that the, not the Islamic religion, still written in Arabic. And I will say that the Nubian that is in question here, the Nubian that is in question, it carries on and states that he does this several times. So the Nubian in question, the Arabs are confident, like, no, there's no way this guy can do this. I'm too far away, and then he gets them all the time, meaning that the skill of these people is well known, and we see someone from 641 AD saying this, at least 641 AD saying this. So their skill with the, as archers is still something that is looked at this time as a high skill amongst these people. Now, of course, no war can just be won by arrows. In fact, you want to see exactly what happened. Look at the ancient Egyptian Ramses image that I showed you. Though they were known as good archers, in that image they're shown being defeated. So of course their skill with the bow and arrow is it shines so brightly that even in loss they are praised. And remember, this is not them being praised by Muslims only. This is the ancient Greeks, the Romans, who during the time of the queen and during the time of the queens, they are said, yes, they had bow and arrows that we just couldn't go through because they were so precise with their weapon. We go back, we see Herodotus saying it as well, saying that the Nubians are very good with their arrows, especially the ones which are marshaled with the Asiatics under the Persians. And then, of course, we have the name Tasseti and so many other people, campaigns. I could show you stele after stele, which talks about how brave and strong they are with the bow and arrow. This means that it's probably not a myth. It's probably something that was a true fact. So I'll finish with two things in the Bible. One about Ethiopians, but one just about the bow in general, the bow and arrow in general. And this one is about how having kids in your youth it's like a comparison of having kids in your youth. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the gods stand watch in vain. In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat, for he grants sleep to those he loves. Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. They will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in court. By the time the Bible was written, even people in Ethiopia had been creating chariots of their own. And perhaps one of the best evidences of this is written in the Bible, where there's just an assumption that they have chariots. As we read, Asa had an army of 300,000 men from Judah, equipped with large shields and with spears, and 280,000 from Benjamin, armed with small shields and with bows. All these were brave fighting men. Zerah the Cushite, sometimes called the Ethiopian, marched out against them with an army of thousands upon thousands and 300 chariots, and came as far as Mareshah. Asa went out to meet him, and they took up battle position in the valley of Zephatha near Mareshah. Then Asa called to the Lord his God and said, Lord, there is no one like you who will help the powerless against the mighty. So, in spite of them having those large shields and bow and arrows, it seems like they are giving credit to the Cushites for being mighty in this case, that the only way they can win is through divine intervention. You are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. The Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The Cushites fled, and Asa and his army pursued them as far as Gerar. Such a great number of the Cushites fell that they could not recover. They were crushed before the Lord and his forces. The men of Judah carried off a large amount of plunder. So, in conclusion, not only is it not a myth, but it seems to carry on throughout the ages, even to people who had never read the source material of the ancient Egyptians, because of course they couldn't read the ancient Egyptian languages, and to random Arabs who did not care about history. Even they had the same opinions about the Nubians and their skill with the arrows. The land of Punt. Its location used to be in question, but today it's settled science. It's somewhere in the Horn of Africa. There is some argument to argue that some parts of the Horn of Africa could have controlled some parts of southern Arabia, but 99% of it is somewhere in the Horn of Africa. Now, the kingdoms of the land of Punt are interesting for a couple of reasons. One, because they made gold. Gold was traded with Egypt from Punt, meaning that Somalians, prior to dates that we think they could trade gold. Think about what I'm saying, 2000 BC trading gold. While the trip made by Hatshepsut to the land of Punt is one of the most fascinating and well detailed visits, it's not the oldest. There's at least 5 older still. These older trips show that the land of Punt transformed over the times. And not only this, it shows that some of the animals that were found in the land of Punt will always be found in that region for at least 2,000 years. There are so many questions to be answered. The first one being, why would they go such a distance? The second one being, why so many repeat journeys? Why was it important for the Egyptians to go there themselves? And what exactly did they want from that region? Did they believe that there was something important? Did they call it Tanecher for the reasons that we think? Is it because they believed that that's where they came from? Is it because they believed that this place itself held religious importance as well as trade? In order to answer these questions, we will have to look at the writings and also the drawings of the land of Punt, the depictions, the animals, the people, the names, and also the DNA recoveries from the animals that have been said to come from the land of Punt. Although most boats in ancient Egypt were designed to travel over rivers, they did have the ability to travel over the sea. But it seemed like they didn't even need to do this because, of course, if this coast is in Africa, what they need to do is to find posts where they could stand before journeying again. And we at least have one person, one author, who writes of his journey to the land of Punt, taking breaks every now and then before eventually reaching the land of Punt. Now, before we go and look at him or any other person, let's first talk about one thing. A Horn of Africa itself. The thinking used to be that hunter-gatherers ruled until about 1000 BC, when Arabians came over and suddenly changed the lifestyle of these people, bringing farming and other things of that nature. But this has already been discredited many times. One, because in Lascaux we see cattle, both domesticated and wild. And not only do we see cattle, we see camels, we also see other portrayals of people organizing and standing in one place. This cave only shows one type of lifestyle, but these people did not all live in caves, as we can see with the depictions at the Kingdom of Punt. This means in Punt, there were many people who were outside of caves like these, and so these people would not be the same types of people. There are possible drawings of foundations showing houses in their squares, but also we can see right next to that human beings who are drawn as tall as the animals, but you can also see wild animals like giraffe, and you can see just below the giraffe a cow. These people are representing something very different going on right now. They're representing an Africa that has communication, possibly with South Arabia, but definitely with the ancient Egyptians. An interesting image from the Horn of Africa is this one, which portrays people holding hands, almost looking like they're swimming. It almost mimics the North African one of the Cave of Swimmers, but instead it is found in Somalia. This reading is from Thutmose III and the Queen. Sailing in the sea, beginning the goodly way towards God's land, journeying in peace to the land of Punt, by the army of the Lord of the two lands, according to the command of the Lord of gods, Amun, Lord of Thieves, presider over Karnak, in order to bring for him the marvels of every country, because he so much loves the king of Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, Makare, Hatshepsut, for his father Amun Ra, Lord of heaven, Lord of earth, more than the other kings who have been in the land forever. So Hatshepsut had a lot of interest going to Nubia, but after going to Nubia, she headed straight for the land of Punt, of course taking the same route that every other pharaoh had taken before in order to reach this place. The others had sent people to travel for them and return with messages, but it seems like she had traveled herself at least in one voyage. Before we interpret, I think we should read the first part, which says, Hatshepsut, who makes my beautiful monuments, who purifies the seat of the great Enid of the gods for my dwelling, as a memorial of her love. Thou art the king, taking possession of the two lands, Nemet, Amun, Hatshepsut, great in oblation, pure in food offerings. Thou satisfiest my heart at all times. I have given thee all life and satisfaction from me, all stability from me, all health from me, all joy from me. I have given to thee all lands and all countries wherein thy heart is glad. I have long intended them for thee, and the eons shall behold them until those myriads of years of usefulness which I have thought to spend. I have given to thee all Punt as far as the lands of God's lands. Now, this is where it's interesting because, of course, the ancient Egyptians, to some degree, are claiming that this land sort of belongs to them in some of their writing. And who can blame them? They believe that they are the chosen of the gods, and then they call this place God's land. So it's possible that these people are talking about people who are the same as themselves, and then saying that these people owe them or they are them in some sense. Now we know that even during Hatshepsut's time, that other people were ruling at this time because they give their names, even names like Nehesi. Now I want to first focus your mind on the first sentence, and you can see there's a word in brackets. That word is remich. That word means people, but it tends to mean Egyptian people, meaning it doesn't usually refer to anybody outside of Egypt. Now, it's important to know this so that you can interpret this phrase seriously in a good way. So, this is what it says. No one trod the myrrh terraces which the people knew not. So, no one trod the myrrh terraces which the Egyptians didn't know of. It was heard from mouth to mouth by hearsay of the ancestors. The marvels brought thence under thy fathers, the kings of lower Egypt, were brought from one to another. and since the time of the ancestors, the kings of Upper Egypt, who were of old, as a return for payments, none reaching them except thy carriers. So you can see here they're talking about how myrrh, which was taken from the land of Punt, the people of Egypt, going way before this person's time, used to talk about this place via mouth to mouth. The Egyptians used to talk about them mouth to mouth. And then what would happen is later these people would bring ornamented items from that place. And so it's already an ancient site to the ancient Egyptians by this time. So it's a mythological site by this time, meaning even though it exists, a lot of it is coming through as a legend, as a story. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because these people who are traveling to this region are not doing it only for trade. Clearly, they have a deeper thing going on about a place that exists to the south, and they put way more importance to it than any other place anywhere on earth. Perhaps another giveaway is the fact that Upper Egyptians have contact with these people. So this gives away the fact that this place is actually located in a direction where it's easier to access if you live in Upper Egypt. Maybe by land, a lot of people from Upper Egypt, let me not even say maybe. I know for a fact that by land, people from Upper Egypt could travel down south to the Sudanese areas where some of the people who are related to these people would go all the way south, and then they would trade with people in the Horn of Africa. The inscription continues to say, "But I will cause thy army to tread them. I have led them on the water and on the land to explore the waters of inaccessible channels, and I have reached the Mur terraces. It is a glorious region of God's land. It is indeed my place of delight. I have made it for myself in order to divert my heart together with Mut Hathor Wereret, mistress of Punt, the mistress great in sorcery, mistress of all gods. They took myrrh as they wished. They loaded the vessels to thy heart, to their heart's content, with fresh myrrh trees, every good gift of this country. Puntites, whom the people, Remich, meaning the Egyptians, know not. Southerners of God's land. I consolidated them by love. So So, of course, that's a lot to unpack here. One, you can see that there is. Let's first start with the fact that these people need to communicate somehow. And the only way that that could happen is if there is some kind of language that they can use to talk to each other. But let's start with the sentences. It is a glorious region of God's land. Remember, Punt, even though some people say it's God's land, is only a piece of God's land. God's land seems to be Sudan going down. It is indeed my place of delight. I have made it for myself in order to divert my heart together with Mut Hathor Weret, mistress of Punt. So you see there that they're already trying to put claim or lay claim on this region. And this is the important part because it's it's clear that they don't see these people as foreigners, not even as close to how they see Upper Egyptians. They took myrrh as they wished. They loaded the vessels to their heart's content with fresh myrrh trees, every good gift of this country. Puntites, whom the people know not, southerners of God's land, I consolidated them by love. Okay, so first let's read the last part where it says they took myrrh. Obviously, he's saying the Egyptians took myrrh, and he says that the Egyptians also took the trees from this country, and they also took Puntites, who the people of the land of Egypt know not. And then here's the important part, because people always act like it was always East and Eastern. Southerners of God's land, I consolidated them by love. If you actually think about what is said here, she's talking about how these people are in the South, and she's almost consolidated, or she's almost put all these people under one banner because of her, let's just call it power, let's leave the love part out of it. Now, a lot of the products that she's talking about, we can look at them as natural resources, but also a lot of these things actually take time to get out of the trees, in this case, of myrrh. It's interesting to think that perhaps this place had always been trading this myrrh, but the middlemen were the Nubians. And so the Nubians and the Sudanese in general would have taken it through. And this way, the ancient Egyptians could have direct access to the myrrh terraces, as she says. Now, of course, a small boat like this would not make such a journey possible, but instead you need something much bigger. And we see this in Deir al-Bahari, portrayed by Hatshepsut's people. If you can't see properly, what you're staring at is a giant ship with hundreds of people, which has possibly sails. As I said, this land was already ancient to the ancient Egyptians, even though it is at the time of Hatshepsut that we get the most amount of information. Now, remember, there's two things here that are important. Gold and myrrh are being brought through this land. And this land is being portrayed with two things. So, what shall we start with? Let's start with the fact that gold has to be collected in order for it to be traded. So we see some genuine interest or original interest in gold by people located in this coast in the Horn of Africa. And also we see some very important things. Now, the boats, which are large, are they represent something that the ancient Egyptians used to do with their carts. See, when the carts came from Asia into the areas of Egypt, what they used to do was they used to assemble them and then disassemble them. And they also did this with the ships. This was an important piece of this because it means that they didn't have to have this giant ship which they park at shore and then they have to like go back and then they have to, instead they could walk on land with these multiple small pieces being carried by the people, the soldiers that came with her, and then it can be put back together again when they get back into the ocean and head towards Punt. How exactly they knew and what maps they used in order to know, okay, now we've reached Punt, I have no idea. But they did draw pictures, they did have writing, and they did say that they got gold and myrrh from this place. And of course, there were so many other things that they traded. One of them resulting in the genes being found of animals in Egypt today. And this is where it it to almost all the scientists, they go, okay, so it must have been located somewhere in the Horn of Africa because the animals that have been genetically tested all come from that region. Now, one thing that people also don't disagree about is that the ancient Egyptians say they come from this place. This is one of the reasons why some people wanted this place to be somewhere in Arabia, because if they say they come from this place, then that is part of the evidences that are put into the theory that ancient Egyptians were like other Africans. Keep in mind, this is not something that they're unaware of. They're aware that the people of Punt look different than the people of Asia. For them to say that we come from this place, and this place, as we know, has had Africans for the longest time. We're talking about 1400 BC here. We're not talking about a time when Asiatics were a big population anywhere near the Horn of Africa. And also, because they say it's where they came from, we're probably talking about 2400 BC because it goes back. It actually goes back probably pre-dynastically this connection between the land of Punt and ancient Egypt. And of course, why would I say that? Well, it's in the sentence when they say that it's the land of their ancestors, the land where their ancestors came from. Well, came from means where they arrived from. Studies predating the one that I'm about to talk about had already shown that the people from Egypt lacked a certain type of primate which is found all over Egypt. So it does not happen in there naturally. But we see it from the time of Narmer, meaning that the people of Punt must have been communicating even with pre dynastic Egypt. So someone must remind me to link the study because I can link it even if I've already uploaded the video. Egyptian iconography of Papio Hamadras, a tradition exceeding 3,000 years, statuette inscribed with the name of King Narmer, early dynastic period, first dynasty, 3150, 3100 BC, reproduced with permission from the museum, blah, blah, blah. As you can see here, they're describing all these baboons and they're saying that these primates that are being depicted here, from starting from Norma, even going to Tutankhamun, all of these different depictions, they're all a sign of the land of Punt because this animal is not naturally found in this region. Now, remember, like I said, the people of Sudan could have easily traded with these people, so these animals could have started from the Horn of Africa, moved through Sudan, and then landed in Egypt. So it's not necessarily that they always had to travel directly to that region in order to get these animals. Depicted here is the distribution of these animals, and as you can see, certain animals are found in certain areas, and they're trying to make the case here that you cannot use Egypt as a pure place for where these animals would come from. As you can see, the arrows pointing. And if we read the study, Egypt lies well beyond the distribution of the P. anubis and the P. hamadryas, and there is no evidence of natural population in Egypt during antiquity. The remains of baboons in Egypt are therefore interpreted as evidence of foreign trade. This figure puts the present study specimen, those numbers, and those of Saqqara into context by illustration. Spatial-temporal variation in the preservation of the baboons, emphasizing differences in taxonomy, wrapping and deposition, burial, tombs, and catacombs. Horizontal bars represent the temporal spans of baboon bearing archaeological sites and known expedition to Punt. Every New Kingdom specimen of P. hamadra is contemporaneous with expeditions to Punt. Figure 2 continued on the next page. So you can see here, they're just admitting right there that there is no way that these animals come from this area. And also, they also line up in size with Punt. So when there's an expedition, there's an access or there's excess of these animals being distributed in the region, meaning that there is almost 100% proof that the land of Punt has to be in the Horn of Africa. Here's a heat map making their point, emphasizing it to the highest end. Spatial estimations of isotope ratios and their differences from target values using empirical Bayesian Kriging specimens, locations of modern baboons, and the normalized difference values for D18 against our target tissue, the hair. Specimen location of the modern baboon, black points, source appendix 1, table 2, and the normalized difference values for 87 SR, 86 SR ratios against our target tissues, the enamel of EA, that number, the combined normalized difference of both isotope ratios against both target tissues. The black line bounds the area within some points in panel. So you can see here where the black line is. So look at the third image. So right under the word view publication, you look at the third image, you see there's that black outline. That's almost where they limit part of these animals where they would be found from. If you can't tell, this is the Horn of Africa, and this makes a huge difference in the history of ancient Egypt and how we look at the way that they traveled and moved and communicated. And it also gives a lot of leeway to the idea that Southern Arabians had access to some parts of the Horn of Africa, and the people from the Horn of Africa had access to that region, meaning that when we talk about the Yemenite kingdoms, that we must be looking at it from a point of view, and this is why I've shown you all those rock engravings showing African animals or things from Africa that were not common in those regions, but you can see depictions of them, probably through trade with Africans. Now, since we're already talking about these baboons, I think it's important that I add the mummy of the baboon. As you can see, it's well preserved. But there's a couple things about it that we need to talk about. One, of course, that this baboon is very well preserved, but not only that, it has this ruddy look to it. You ever notice that a lot of people that take mummies and say, oh, they must be European because of their look? Well, look how this obvious baboon that is not this color naturally looks. But not only that, let's look at its hair. Now, I don't know about you, but this looks almost 100% similar to those other mummies that we find all over Egypt, which people say they must have had blonde hair. But you can see here that this baboon's hair has changed color. It's become blonde. Well, how is that possible? Well, if it was up to the people who like to pretend like everything just changes is like based on the reality, then we have to assume that monkeys or baboons from Africa in the past were blonde. So they traded blonde monkeys all the way down to this place, which is hilarious. But in real life, we know that this happens through years and years of something sitting under the ground or in a room, mummified. The color starts getting extracted, removed, oxidization, so many things that are playing a role. It's hilarious that I have to show this, by the way, because why? Why do I have to show this? Why can't people just understand that with humans that it's impossible to have blonde people in ancient Egypt, and instead it was this as a result of this. But let's not dwell too long on that. Here is a depiction, one showing Asiatics at the bottom. These Asiatics are bringing in treasures from their lands, and at the top they're showing Puntites. And as you can see, some of them are dressed like Egyptians, especially the ones at the front. Their skin color is depicted as highly dark, and two of them are seen with a skin color that almost looks much lighter than the others, but that, as you can see, that's the chipping away of the color. The one holding the giraffe is probably the lightest one of the few, and everyone else is basically very, very dark. This means that these people, the people of Egypt, were very aware of what the people of the land of Punt look like. So, why would they say that these people, by the way, let's first pause a second. Okay, so these people are the people from the land of Punt, and they bring these things there. This sort of removes any question that it's from Africa, but it also removes the idea that it's from this Saudi Arabian, Yemeni area place because, people don't really look like that over there, except, of course, if you're saying that they do, which means that there were Africans located in those regions, which they're not going to accept because that's going to expand the empire of Africans to be larger, but that's another story. So we can continue. And like I said, there's a giraffe, African, cheetahs, African, all of these things that they're bringing African. And the interesting part is that a lot of these people actually went to Egypt themselves. So they were taken to Egypt themselves. And again, it's interesting that they say that these are the people that we came from. They know they're dark skinned, they know they're black, they know they're in Africa, they know they're deep in that region. And then if we square that with the fact that Herodotus said that the practices of ancient Egypt clearly come from other Africans. It seems like the ancient Egyptians are not just saying this as a statement. I mean, it seems like we could dismiss it as just like, oh, they were just saying that there were dumb Egyptians in the past, and the dumb Egyptians were just saying stuff in the past because it sounded cool. Yeah, they came from the mythological land of Punt. Isn't that crazy? But in real life, what they probably meant was, based on everything we know, we probably came from this direction. And based on how well documented the ancient Egyptians are, and how well they know things back in the day, I don't think they would just say that as a flippant statement. And then, of course, you can take the fact that they put in so much money in order to go to these areas. As one Egyptologist said, you can see the direction that Punt is because the people at the top, though most of them be Puntites, it seems like the items they bring are mixed up with that of the Nubians, meaning that it's taken as a whole Southerners thing. So, in other words, it's not just a thing where we can say, oh, there is no connection between Nubia and the people of Punt. It seems like there's a strong connection between these people. Clothing and animals. So let's first look at what we can find in the Horn of Africa. What we see here is a cow, obviously. Everything about this is a cow. It's depicted in a strange way, but let me try and break it down for you. It looks random a little bit, right? But let's look at the cow's neck. Does that color sort of look somewhat similar to you? Does it not remind you of the Pangrave things where it's red, black, red, black, red, black, and in this case, red, black, and white? Does it not remind you of those colors? But let's leave that for a while because that's speculation. But let's go down to the person who is depicted right under the cow. Seen under the cow, you see a person dressed in a curious top, and I don't know what that is, but a very curious top, and his arms are spread wide. This is probably a praise position, but it's probably also a depiction of a dance where someone is spreading their arms wide like cattle. It is very interesting to see this early because these were built around about 4000 BC. Even if we didn't have that information from the land itself, we have ancient Egyptians to thank for depicting the fact that there were cattle in those areas. For example, let's read marvels brought to His Majesty in the land of Punt in the year dried myrrh, Heket, gold, Deben, Kiddet, slaves, males and females, oxen and calves, bulls, total cattle, 419 total cattle, besides vessels laden with ivory, ebony skins of the panther, every good thing of this country. So, what I wanted to focus there was the actual items rather than the number. Obviously, you can see there's the number because it's actually well depicted, it's well written in ancient Egypt how many things they got. So, if we read it again, but this time let's not skip the numbers. It says dried myrrh, 1,685. Heket gold, which they don't know the number, 155 Deben, 2 Kiddet, 134 slaves, 114 oxen and calves, 305 bulls, total 419 cattle, besides laden and ivory, ebony, or of the panther, every good thing of this country. So what you can see there is cattle as early as this. If you accept that the land of Punt is in the Horn of Africa, then you accept that there were cattle going back 1400 BC. Again, a lot of these ideas, which were accepted by some people in the past, are now coming together perfectly. Being able to capture this many cattle from this one region is kind of crazy. In some of my previous videos, I showed how people used to praise. So these are like prayer hands in ancient Egypt before prayer hands became putting your hands together. It's lifting them up in the sky like this. The Zulus and almost everybody in Africa does this. And as you can see there, there's a glorification in the bottom of someone lifting their hands. Now, I want to speak to this idea of Saudi Arabia being the homeland of this place. Now remember, Saudi Arabia is not in the historical record in ancient Egypt in any way, shape, or form. The idea that Oman, Yemen, or any of these places has pretty much been dismissed by all historians, especially those who have seen the genetic evidence. It means that Saudi Arabia, even though it was a great place, is only mentioned with a few people coming in, which are called Bedouins at the time. Well, not at the time, later. They are called Bedouins. These are the people from the Asiatic regions who are a newcomer, in a sense, probably representing a kingdom within Saudi Arabia that grew, and then they saw the results in Egypt with people coming in, a small amount of people. And remember, I read the whole thing about Arabs and the history of the Arabs and all of that. That's where their history goes, but it does not go in the direction where they delete anything about Punt or anything like that. And so the ideas of the Arabs being the founders of the ancient Egyptians, all of that is nonsense. Now, keep in mind that there are other things that come from the land of Punt that are important. For example, if you notice, this person in their hand has got a stick, but this isn't any stick, it's actually a boomerang. And boomerangs have been found in ancient Egypt, just like they've been found in Australia, and some of them have been tested, and they actually do have the ability to return to the owner, just like the boomerangs found in the Australian regions. These are believed to come from the kingdom of Punt. Why? Well, one of the things that's written down by the ancient Egyptians as something that they traded is a throwing stick. Now, if it's just a normal stick, you don't need to trade with it because that would be a waste of space. But as you can see, listed in under the tree. So we look down, go past God's land, king, by the trees. Under the trees, we see that some of the things that are traded with the ancient Egyptians are from the land of Punt are electrum, eye cosmetics, a throw sticks of the Puntites. That's a very important part. Throw sticks of the Puntites, meaning that these boomerangs that come from this specific area are of the Puntites. And that tells us more about the people living in that region and what exactly they were doing. Now, let's finish with Hatshepsut for 1 second. So, blah, 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 kissing the earth of Hatshepsut by the chiefs of Punt, the Nubian troglodytes, these are the people to the west, of Kentum, Nofer, every country, and then it lists the countries, doing obeisance with bowed head, bearing their tribute to the place where Her Majesty is located, ways not trodden by others. Every country is dominion of Her Majesty and counted Lord of Thebes as tribute each year, which her father Amun for her appointed for her who hath set all the lands beneath her sandals, living forever. They say as okay, so this is over the chiefs of Punt. They say as they pray for peace from Her Majesty, hail to thee, King of Egypt, Ra, who shines like the sun, your sovereign mistress of heaven. Thy name reaches as far as the circuit of heaven, the fame of Makeri, Hatshepsut, encircles the sea. Now, it's important to understand that we have a language problem here. What language were the people in this area speaking? If you believe the African spread of the Afro-Asiatic language, then they must have been speaking a Kushite language. But in order for the ancient Egyptians to understand it, Kushite wouldn't help either. So it might have been a Nubian language in which was translated to Hatshepsut and the others, so a Sudanic language that is similar. Or they might have just trained some people to speak ancient Egyptian so they could understand them. Because, of course, what you see now is names being listed which are missing here, but there are names of actual people and actual tribes and names, and they are thought to be the exact names of the tribes as described by the people, because there are not just one journey to this region, but there are multiple. I have spent the entire time of this video depicting Hatshepsut going to those locations, but there has to be at least 3 more videos of this type that depicts what the others did, namely Mentuhotep III, who was at least 500 years before her, and Amenhotep III. Both of these people also took trips to that region. And remember, I told you that it's not always the exact same thing they find there. Obviously, myrrh there, gold there, but there are other things that we can find. And of course, what the most important thing here is not that Egypt had communication with deep parts of Africa. The most important thing is that Egypt is now basically drawing what East Africa would have looked like. And if we couple this with the information that we already have about East Africa, especially about Motaman, who was who we were able to genetically test, showing that 4,000 years ago, the area of East Africa was mainly untouched by anyone outside of the region, including people who would be in North Africa. It shows that the history of this region is probably more mysterious than we think. I think it was because DNA became very popular in 2016. When this was discovered, it became world news. It says the Petrus bone. Ancient genomes have been sequenced from around the world, but Africa has proved difficult because hot and humid conditions can destroy fragile DNA. However, the 4,500-year-old remains of a hunter-gatherer known as Motaman were found in the cave and were well preserved. Importantly, a bone situated just below the ear, called the Petrus bone, was intact. Dr. Manika, speaking to Science in Action on the BBC World Service, said the Petrus bone is really hard and does a really good job of preventing bacteria getting in and degrading the DNA. What we are able to get is some very high quality, undamaged DNA from which we could reconstruct the whole genome of the individual. We have the complete blueprint, every single gene, every single bit of information that made this individual that lived 4,500 years ago in Ethiopia. 4,500 years ago is 2,500 BC, and it's about the same time that we see that Laskiel thing where we start to see cattle and all that other stuff being portrayed. So let's see what they said about the DNA. The genome revealed that Motorman had purely African DNA. His ancestors had never moved from Africa, but the comparison of this with modern African genomes highlighted that about 1,500 years after his death, the makeup of the continent had changed. Genetic studies have shown that after the Great Migration out of Africa, which happened about 60,000 years ago, some people later returned to the continent. But this study shows that about 3,000 years ago, there was a much larger migration than had been thought. So the representation that today reflects the mixing of the Ethiopians means that that migration must have been huge. Otherwise, it must have started early in dribs, but it didn't start early because we can see here, because of Motorman, a pure African DNA, which is not really that replicated today everywhere. Now, the only reason why I'm emphasizing this is so that we can get this idea out of the way that, okay, maybe the people of Punt were Asians or something like that. Maybe people living in the Horn of Africa were Asians. They were not. They were not. And it's only really when you start going about 500 BC that you start seeing them moving in large numbers, meaning the combination of two empires the one in Yemen and the one in the Horn of Africa. Now, I don't believe that the Horn of Africa and Horn of Africa and Asia have completely been separate forever. I think the boats that have been found and everything means that they could easily travel. And if you look at the gap in between Yemen and the African areas, it would take one curious person to cross it. By 1200 BC, the Ethiopians had many more partners than they'd ever had. A new kingdom, the Sabaean kingdom, formed at this time. The Egyptians, sent by Ramses III, carried down some messages and built wells along the Sudanic road all the way to Ethiopia, where we would call the land of Punt today. Now, the only problem here is that these represent the Eastern trade. There are three other trades that were happening at this time. The first coming from down south. We do not know who these people were by 1200 BC, but coming from the South African regions, we do see that there are people who emerge from there to trade with the Ethiopians. On the other side, we have the Nubian culture. The Nubian culture, or the Sudanic culture, whatever you want to call it, they trade heavily, and in fact, they've been trading for a long time. And they also represent an Eastern trade. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, which are camels. Camels represent the structure and the travel of the people living in Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and also the people living in Ethiopia by this period. We know that there were a lot because bones have been found in these regions, both of them at this time, and we know that they were definitely domesticated. But the question is, how far back were they domesticated? Many bones have been found that go back to 2000 BC, but a lot of them are thought to be non domesticated in the Middle East and in Africa. Now, remember the Pangraves? Let's go back to the Pangraves before we come back and talk about 1200 BC. So, like always, I'm first going to read this and then I'm going to explain. A bone fragment, which can definitely be assigned to a dromedy, was found during the excavation of several graves belonging to the Nubian Pangrave culture, 1800 to 1600 BCE. At the Upper Nile, given the rare occurrence of camel remains in Egypt, the find of some sherds with the incised sketch of a dromedy has to be regarded as one of the most spectacular finds of the last decades. The shards from the city of Ramses belong to a dish made from local Nile clay, which is dated to the late 18th or early 19th dynasty. 14th to 13th centuries BCE. It seems that dromedaries were principally known during this period. It should be stressed that the Nile Delta is not the natural habitat of the dromedary because of its high humidity. Therefore, any artifacts depicting the camel from the city of Ramses has a strong probability to refer to domesticated animals. This evidence virtually supports a long known artifact from the tomb of the later 13th century, namely kneeling camel loaded with two jars from the early first millennium BCE. We have some camel remains which were found in Qasr Ibrahim in Egyptian Nubia. In view of this, it is all the more astonishing that the camel is never mentioned in any Egyptian text known today. There are no entries of camel in Egyptian dictionaries and no depictions of camels are known. Did the Egyptians use another word or phrase for camel, which has not yet been identified? Some suggested that the camel was ignored by the Egyptians for aesthetic reasons. but there is virtually no evidence of this. Another reason may be seen in the fact that the camel was associated with people from Western Asia who were often regarded as enemies. Nevertheless, in the later stages of the Egyptian language, a term for camel turns up as a Semitic loanword. The form of the word for camel in Demotic and Coptic, chamel, shows inner Egyptian sound changes which require its adoption before the 7th century BCE, probably at the beginning of the first millennium BCE or earlier. Curiously, the earliest known inscription reference to camels in Egypt are not from Egypt but from Mesopotamia. On the famous black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, two Bactrian camels are depicted on relief as the tribute of the land of Misri. Some 200 years later, Esarhaddon introduced camels, which he had obtained from Arabian chieftains, to carry water for the use of his army into Egypt. The evidence for the camel in Egypt has to be evaluated in the light of the natural habitat of this camel. The evidence of a desert animal should be expected to be marginal in comparison with the commonly well attested livestock, sheep, goats, cattle, and donkeys. While for Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Levant well defined archaeological and artistic evidence for the domesticated camel before the first millennium BC is elusive. Iran and its adjacent regions is an area which definitely yields more data. So, what were we reading? In order to answer this, we have to think about what makes sense. So, as you can see, Ethiopians have the same hairstyle as those of the ancient Nubians. But let's go back to a theory that I said before. Remember, I said the Pangrave people seem to speak a Cushitic language, and they are desert dwellers. In other words, they are Nubians who were of the desert. The Medjay, for example, are these desert dwelling police officers in the eastern side of Egypt, ancient Egypt. And these people represent that type of people, and they probably were a Cushitic speaking people. Well, the Cushitic people come from where? Usually about Ethiopia. Now, I'm not saying that they came from this place, but that they had a trade route which connected these people, and they were genetically the same as these people. These Nubians, which we can call Cushitic Nubians, but of course that's kind of confusing. The Cushitic Nubians that are of the East, represented today by obviously the Horn of Africa, but in the north, represented by a group that still rides camels today. And it was even written in Islamic texts their love for camels. The Beja. The Beja people, still to this day, represent a connection between Ethiopia and Egypt. They almost fit everything about these people: camel herding, camel riding, nomadic, traveling through from Sudan all the way to Egypt. And remember, in the time of Ibn Battuta, they were in charge of a large piece of Egypt. They've been pushed back in the modern world, but we'll get back to that. And you can see how these people would have driven the camel all the way up into Egypt in the past. These Pangraves almost leave no room for discussion that the camel was first domesticated in Africa, in Ethiopia, and then it was moved to Yemen, probably about the same time it was invented, so maybe about 2000 BC, but then was also moved into Egypt by a Beja type people, a Cushitic people around 2000 BC, close to when the Pangraves exist. I hope now you understand that I did not just introduce the Pangraves, the Nubian Pangraves, just for show. Now, the important part is when we're reading this, that the place where we find this camel in Egypt, and there's many reasons written in this for us to believe that it was Nubian, but let's first start with the first thing they say. So, a bone fragment, which can definitely be assigned to a dromedy being a camel, was found during the excavation of several graves belonging to the Nubian Pangrave culture in 1800 to 1600 BC. So, this would be pretty early. Now, we do know where camels were naturally found. They obviously, just like the horse, do not come from Egypt, but let's do the quick evolution real quick. So the horse and the camel look weird because they first evolve in the Americas and then they migrate all the way into Asia and land up in Africa. And it's interesting that it's the Nubian Pangraves, it's the Nubians that are the ones who are seen with this animal in their graves. And like they say, when we continue to read, at the Upper Nile, given the rare occurrence of camel remains in Egypt, the find of some sherds with an incised sketch of the dromedy has to be regarded as one of the most spectacular finds of the last decades. The sherd from the city of Ramses belonged to a dish made from local Nile clay, which is dated to the late 18th and 19th dynasty in the 14th to 13th centuries BCE, which is close to where Ramses takes over, both Ramses the first, second, and third. It seems that dromedaries were principally known during that period. It should be stressed that the Nile Delta is not the natural habitat of the dromedaries because of its high humidity. Therefore, any artifact depicting the camel from the city of Ramses has a strong probability to refer to domesticated animals. This means these Nubians who are carrying these animals into this region represent a pure domestication. So we have evidence of African domestication that goes around about 2000 BC. The rest of it, of course, discusses the fact that we do not see any real representation of camels in the past. And of course, this might be because it was seen belonging to the foreigners. Now, there are some suggestions, of course, that they talk about here that it maybe they saw it from Asiatics and then they assumed that it was the foreigners. But this Pangrave thing makes us know that they saw it first from the Nubians. And then, of course, we get to the other page where they talk about the fact that even the far Asiatic countries seem to have first cited camels from Egypt and then they adopted them, which means that the Nubians inspired them to use camels. But if we go back again to Ramses, what we see is the same type of writings that we've seen before. One of the most curious things that we heard said in the previous writings about the land of Punt was that they came to Egypt. There's a part in the writing, a writing from ancient Egypt, that says, I make the land of Punt come to Egypt. But let's read it. I'm paraphrasing it. As we can see here, it's the hymn to Amun, utterance of Amun, king of gods, my son of my body, my beloved Nimare, my living image, whom my limbs created. whom Mut, mistress Ashuru, Thebes, bore to him, mistress of the nine bows, who brought thee up as the sole lord of thee. My heart greatly rejoices when I see the beauty. I work a wonder for thy majesty, and thou renewest youth, according as I have set thee as the son of the two lands. When I turn my face to the south, I work a wonder for thee. I cause the chiefs of Cush, the wretched, to turn to thee, bearing all the tribute upon their backs. When I turn my face to the north, I work a wonder for thee. I cause the countries of the ends of Asia to come to thee, bearing all their tribute upon their backs. They present themselves to thee with their children, in order that thou mayest give it to them the breath of life. When I turn my face to the west, I work a wonder for thee. I cause thee to seize the Tenu, so that there is no remnant of them. They are building in the fortress in the name of the majesty, surrounded with a great wall reaching to heaven, settled with the children of the chiefs of the Nubian troglodytes. And here's the important part. When I turn my face to the orient or the east, I work a wonder for thee. I cause to come to thee countries of Punt. Now I want you to think about what's just been said there. So the people of Punt, just like all the other people, are caused to come to Egypt, as it's written in the hymn to Amun. The people of Punt, as you can see, are not so distant that they will never arrive. They will arrive. And it's obvious to me, looking at the hair, looking at the camel culture, because camels were not first domesticated in Egypt, and looking at so many other details, that we are looking at a long culture, a long spanning culture of Cushite, Puntite relations that span the entire distance. It isn't a wonder to think that camels that are used by Nubians probably belong to other Africans within the African continent, especially if we consider the fact that it is said and is known that camels do not originate from Egypt. We have images from Egypt of camels, but a lot of them come from way later. They come from like the 3rd century or the 4th century. And of course, you remember that the Romans and the Greeks, they didn't really associate camels with Egypt either, but instead with the Nubians. And since we know that the area where camels at least must have come from is Yemen or is Ethiopia or the Axumite regions, I call that the Horn of Africa. That means that we are talking about a true expansion, and the Pangraves that I was talking about must be these Cushites. There is always a conversation about ancient Egyptians and what did they know about the people living in the Nubian regions and stuff like that. But here's the final writing or the final scriptness of it. Curiously, the earliest known inscription reference to camels in Egypt are not from Egypt but Mesopotamia. On the famous black obelisk of Sahil Mansur III in the 9th century BCE, two Bactrian camels are depicted on a relief as the tribute of the land of Misri. Some 200 years later, Esarhaddon introduced camels which he had obtained from Arabian chieftains to carry water from the use of his army into Egypt. So you can see here we're talking about a later period, and we're also talking about the reference to Egypt. But what reference is this? This is a reference to the Nubian people. How do I know? Well, who else had it in all the evidence that we've gathered? Now, of course, the last part gives off the information that I said that there's a different type of camel that might have been domesticated on the other side of Asia, near Persia, while for Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula and the Levant, well-defined archaeological and artistic evidence for the domestication of camels before the first millennium BCE is elusive. Iran and its adjacent regions is an area which definitely yields more data. So by Egypt, by India and Iran, let's wait for part two. Subscribe, uh, and do all the other stuff. Subscribe, like, share, donate if you can. These videos don't pay that much because I don't have that many views. So if you guys can be so kind, that would be much appreciated. And also, um, I'm gonna put out a video where I'm gonna take all the punt videos and put them all together to create one long video, and this will be part of them. So don't be alarmed when you see a video that is long and think I'm repeating videos or anything like that. I'm just putting it together so if you want the entire Punt series, you can see the whole thing. So let's talk about the land of Punt once again. But first, what we have to do is look at this map. This map here gives us a distribution of the Cushitic languages. Why is this important? Well, the Cushitic languages seem to be at least stuck in the eastern or the horn of Africa. But we know that the Beja also speak a Cushitic language, and the Beja are located in Egypt. And we also know that the Beja, through DNA and other things, are native at least 4000 BC in ancient Egypt, which means the people of Punt have a connection with a people who spoke the same language as them, are genetically related to them, and have also got some, let's say, drawings that have been alleged by historians to represent the Beja. So you're going to need to remember this when we talk about the fact that the land of Punt is going to be explored about 2000 BC. There are some mentions of the Punt people going back to about 3000 BC, but they don't need any real recital as the information is scarce and sometimes the words can be thought of as different than what we think they mean. The first real evidence that we have that is highly detailed comes from Mentuhotep III's time. During Mentuhotep III's time, which is 2000 BC, we start to see real Punt writings. Now, to show you a difference here, the Hatshepsut writing is about 1400 BC in the later period, so 1450 BC onwards. And remember, the higher the number, the longer ago it was, the lower the number, the closer it is to our time. So by the time of Mentuhotep III, we're talking about 400 years prior to the previous trip that we were investigating. 400 years prior to that date. Imagine what has changed in Ethiopia at the time. Ethiopia being that entire horn of Africa in this reference. On reading the achievements of Mentuhotep II, he seemed like he left no room for improvement, that he made so many great uniting achievements going as far as Asia and Nubia that you couldn't even think that someone could top him. But of course, it happened. Mentuhotep III sent a large expedition to the land of Punt, 3,000 men, as it said, which were first accompanied by a 10,000 that stopped on the hills of Nubia. So the first 10,000 stopped at the hill of Nubia, and then a further 3,000 made it all the way to Punt. When they got to Punt, they gathered many objects and many items and then brought them back. And this is 2000 BC. Keep that in mind. And so what we're about to read is the text written by Henu, which, by the way, Henu was not a one-trick pony. He actually did a lot of things, but we're going to focus right now on what he did in Punt. Now, this is what he wrote in his autobiography detailing his trip to Punt. He also has other writings that detail his trip back from Punt, which we will look at later. My lord sent me forth to dispatch ships to Punt, to bring back for him fresh incense from the rulers dwelling in the Red Land. For of him pervading the uplands thereupon, I went up from Coptus upon the road which his majesty had commanded me to take, I being accompanied by a force of Upper Egypt from Webel of the Theban nome, from Imoteru to Shabat. The text goes on and describes the personnel and the outfitting of 3,000 men. Now I made 12 wells on the valley floor, and 2 wells in Edet, one measuring 20 cubits, the other 30. I made another in Ehib of 10 by 10 cubits at all water levels. Then I reached the Wadir, and then I built this fleet. I loaded it with everything. When I had made for it a great sacrifice of cattle and goats, when I returned from the Wadir, I had done that which his majesty had commanded me to do, bringing back for him all sorts of produce that I had found on the shores of the God's land, to nature. I descended from Weg, an unidentified place, and Rehenu, the Egyptian name for Wadi Hamamat, bringing for him precious stone blocks for the temple's statues. Now, this thing here that is written is actually written in Wadi Hamamat itself. Okay, so that's the dry reading, but now let's start to break down exactly what he's talking about. So he says, My Lord sent me forth to dispatch ships to Punt to bring back for him fresh incense. Let's stop there. So you see here that we are seeing the same substance that is being talked about by Hatshepsut at least 500 years later, in the sense of frankincense and stuff like that being talked about in this same place. So it is not talking about a different place. They haven't been mistaken. They're not thinking of a place that is different. They're thinking about the exact same point that was mentioned earlier. And if we read again, my Lord sent me, the Lord, of course, being Mentuhotep III, sent me forth to dispatch ships to Punt to bring back for him fresh incense from the rulers dwelling in the Red Land. From the rulers dwelling in the Red Land. This, of course, mentioning the deserty areas. Fear of him pervading the uplands thereupon. I went up from Coptus, as you can see there's Coptus written over there on the map if you look. And then, of course, there's Wadi Hamamat on the line. If you look at the line to Qasir, you will see that there's Wadi Hamamat right in the middle. So let's read again. I went up from Coptus upon the road which his majesty had commanded me to take. Now let's break down that second paragraph. So we've already gone past the Punt and fresh incense. So he says later, from the rulers dwelling in the Red Land, as you can see on the map that I put on the side, pointing, the rulers of the Red Land, we talk about the Eastern Desert here. So the Eastern Desert is what he's trying to avoid next to the Red Sea. And you can see he says, fear of him pervading the uplands thereupon. So he had fear of the lands that were in this area. Well, basically, he says Mentuhotep had fear of the people of the Eastern Desert because obviously they might be treacherous. This means he's not fully stable of the control of those people. And then he carries on to say, which is a great insight, considering that he didn't need to put that in. And then he says, thereupon I went up from Coptus upon the road which his majesty had commanded me to take. So if you break that down, you can see that he was told to travel through the Nile, avoid the red lands. Remember, Kem meaning the black lands. So he avoided the black lands. He avoided the red lands and traveled through the black lands, meaning he traveled through the Nile and landed in Coptus. And as you can see, where I zoomed in was Coptus, and the map on the other side shows Coptus zoomed in, but I wanted you to see exactly where it is. It's very it's in Upper Egypt, and in Upper Egypt he starts to explain. I being accompanied by a force of Upper Egypt. So let's pause right there. So he says that he is being accompanied by a force of Upper Egypt. So clearly, the person is in charge of the Upper Egyptians at this time, just not the people of the Redlands, at least not all the people of the Redlands. And you can see there where he says, I took a force. This force is not small, by the way, as we will read, of Upper Egypt from the Wubu of the Theban nome of Imyoteru to Shabbat. Now let's think about who these Wubu are. Well, these Wubu are located in the regions where we would call them Beja regions. It's possible that the people that he took from Upper Egypt are the ancestors of the today Beja. So it's possible that the Wubu is just another name for the Beja today of Upper Egypt. Now, I want to state that the word Wubu is not a tribe name, it's a place name. It's a place name, not a tribe name. But we don't know exactly where it's located. We do know that it's a place, and we know it's in this region, but we don't know exactly where it's located. Of the Theban nome, from Imyoteru to Shabet. The text goes on to describe the personal and outfitting of the 3,000 men. So 3,000 men are taken from Upper Egypt. So these are like Nubian type people, possibly Beja, speaking a Cushitic language, which would make sense because if they speak a Cushitic language, they could go with him to Punt and immediately translate the language. If we take this into consideration, let's just break this down for a second. So as we can see here, the Beja, which are probably called the Blemis by the Greeks, are located in this region, and you can see there that they speak an Afro-Asiatic, Cushitic, North Cushitic Beja, which means that they could possibly communicate with the people of what do you call that? They could communicate with the people of Punt because the people of Punt, again, according to linguists, spoke a Cushitic language, Southern Cushitic language. This could be the difference between just traveling there for no reason and traveling there and understanding that the people there are ancient and can speak the same language as people in Upper Egypt, and it might have given them the impression that these were the descendants. And another thing to look at, and we've talked about these type of Sudanic type of people, is the fact that the Beja are also accused, and it's probably true, of being the Medjay, part of the Medjay at least. So these Nubians that were marshaled on the side of Egypt, on the desert parts of Egypt, to guard that area against, you know, rebel forces of Nubian tribes and stuff like that. So they're Nubians who are sent by Egyptians to go guard other Nubians who live in the Red Lands in the Eastern Desert, to guard those people so that they don't, get out of line. So why am I telling you this? Well, it tells you that there might actually be something to the thought that the people of Punt are the ancestors of the people of Egypt, because there is a direct connection linguistically, geographically, pottery wise and stuff like that, but we're not going to talk about that just yet. and also the Pangrave people. And even that writing of that man, the Nubian, the Nahesi, even that guy might represent that giant expansion of the Cushitic languages. This is important because, like I said, they will further travel south. They will further travel south and back and forth. And it's possible that this travel back and forth left some Egyptians in those regions speaking the language. And remember what I said earlier, the Cushitic languages was a minority language in Egypt, and we can prove that. So let's carry on with his reading. I, being accompanied by a force of Upper Egypt from the Wubu of the Theban nome from Imioteru to Shabbat or Shabet. The text goes on to describe the personnel and outfitting of 3,000 men. Now I made 12 wells on the valley floor, and 2 wells in Edet, one measuring 20 cubits, the other 30. I made another in Ehitib of 10 by 10 cubits at all water levels. Then I reached the Wad War, and then I built this fleet. I loaded it with everything when I had made for a great sacrifice of cattle and goats. When I returned from the Wodwar, I had done that which His Majesty had commanded me to do, bringing back for him all sorts of produce that I had found on the shores of the God's land. So he's already reached the shores, he's already landed there, and he's bringing back different types of foods and incense, as he was promised, the same incense that we'll see being brought back by Amenhotep, being brought back by Hatshepsut, being brought back by Ramses III, who also genetically has been tested as a African man. And we will see that, yes, this writing is there. I descended from Hekwa, an unidentified place, and of Rehenu, the Egyptian name for Wadi Hamamat, bringing for him precious stone blocks for the temple statues. So you can see here, even though there's a lot to learn in general about who these people were and how they traveled, and there's a reason why I had to bring the Cushitic thing in here, because he's his input is so little when it comes to actually landing in Punt. And also he says that he stayed by the shores. He doesn't talk about going inland. He stayed by the shores. Bringing 3,000 people and only staying by the shores of Punt is crazy. But it also tells us that he's not. So when you hear people say he went to Oman or he went to. Nah, he did not go that far. Also, he traveled by land, as you can see. Like he was hopping from one piece of land to the next. So Wediwar is one of the lands. Then Hakur is another part of the land. Ebet is another part of the land. Ehitib is another land. So he's land hopping as he travels, meaning he's traveling through one continent. He's not jumping over the Red Sea. He would have stated, I mean, they had a name for the Red Sea. Sadly, in Egypt, there's usually no follow up. Usually, there's nothing to carry on the story. You just have to sort of build the story yourself. And we could talk about Blamies, we could talk about Kushites, we could talk about the language. But exactly why would someone send someone to Punt? What is the deep excursion need to go all the way to Punt to go fetch these things? Why not burn something else? Why not use something else? I'm sure there were perfumes from Asia. I'm sure there were perfumes from Libya. Why this specific place? And also, where is the follow up? Okay, so you brought them back. Now what? Now, of course, we can see that the ancient Egyptians and the Upper Egyptians have some similarities based on the writings, the animal sacrifice that he did. That animal sacrifice, by the way, is less common with lower Egyptians. You see it way more with upper Egyptians, as I've shown you with those pan graves. as I've shown you with the Nubian king that killed 5,000 cattle after, well, he didn't do the slaughtering, but a bunch of people did it for him after he died, and there was 5,000 cattle by his grave. And so part of that slaying might be a tribute to the Nubian people. But let's think about it. This person, Mentuhotep III, might be Nubian himself. It might not be something that is foreign to him. It might be something that is he's accustomed to. So let's see if we can find details of both what happened after this journey and then also what happened to the Puntites when they left, when the Egyptians left. Now remember, the age is 2000 BC. All we need is information about what was happening in Ethiopia in 2000 BC. So we have an inscription from ancient Egypt from Wadi Hammamat. So I will first give it a cold read or a dry read so that we can get a taste of what it is. Then I'll explain it like I did last time. So it says, second month, year two, second month of the season of inundation, day 15. Horus, Lord of the two lands, two ladies, Lord of the two lands, God of gold, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, son of Ra, Mentuhotep. May he live forever. His Majesty commanded the erection of this stele for his father Min, Lord of the foreign lands, on this august mountain, primordial one, foremost in the land of the horizon dwellers. Divine palace endowed with life, divine nest of Horus in which this god flourishes, his pure place of enjoyment above the countries of the god's land, in order to satisfy his spirit and to honor the god as he desires, as does a king who is on the great throne. Foremost, enduring of monuments, excellent God, Lord of joy, much feared, greatly loved, heir of Horus in his two lands, reared by divine Isis, mother of men, and Weret Hekau, for the kingship of the two banks of Horus, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebtuare, may he live Ra forever, says Majesty sent the Prince Regent, leader of the city, vizier, overseer of works, royal confidant Amenemhet, together with an expedition of 10,000 men from the southern provinces of Upper Egypt and from south of Wabut, to bring me a precious block of pure stone of this mountain, whose excellence was made by men, for a sarcophagus of an eternal memorial, and for monuments in the temple of Upper Egypt, as a mission of the king, chief of two lands, to bring the heart's desire from the lands of his father Min. He created it as his monument for his father Min of Coptus, lord of the foreign lands, chief of the troglodytes, that may be given very much life, and live like Ra forever. Day 27. The lid of the sarcophagus descended, a block of 4 cubits by 8 cubits by 2 cubits, as it came from the works. Calves were slaughtered, goats were sacrificed, incense was put on the fire. An expedition of 3,000 sailors from the provinces of Lower Egypt conducted it safely to Egypt. So if you can tell here, there's already many clues leading up to the Puntites with the 3,000 men and the incense and all of that. That information tells us that we are dealing with a time that the Punt mission has been restated. In other words, we have a follow-up. But how can we have a follow-up? Let's look at the first one. We know we know that the mission to Punt by Mentuhotep III was in his 8th year, and this is in the 2nd year. So what does this mean? Well, it means that this is Mentuhotep IV. This is the next king. And how do I know that it's the next king? Well, there's a clue on the next page before we go back and read it. This is why it's important to pay attention. So if you look there, the name Nebtwawire is the pharaoh name for Mentuhotep IV, as you can see. So this journey by Mentuhotep's people in his reign made it past his death. It was such a big event that it was documented after he had died and the next pharaoh had taken over. 2045 BCE to about 1985 BCE. That's the reign of Mentuhotep IV. So this that we're reading right here is not Mentuhotep III. This is afterwards, meaning it's a follow up, but years later. So now we can revisit it. Year 2, second month of the season of inundation, day 15. Horus, Lord of the Two Lands, Two Ladies, Lord of the Two Lands, Gods of Gold, the King of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebtweri Tuire, son of Re, Mentuhotep, may he live forever. His Majesty commanded the erection of this stele for his father Min, lord of the foreign lands, on this august mountain, primordial one. Now, it may seem like I'm just rereading it, but yet there's not that many clues here about what exactly we're going into. And of course, I've already said that Nebtwawire shows that this is Mentuhotep the fourth that we're dealing with. The way we separate it by calling him the fourth or whatever was not necessary in ancient Egypt because of course they had other names. It's almost like having a last name or something. They had like 4 or 5 different names, so you can always tell which one they're talking about. By the way, this is the god Min, and he is the one who's being explained as the god of the foreign lands. I will let you guess why this person is being associated with the eastern lands of East Africa. Now, again, we need to get to the clues that will tell us exactly what place we're talking about, but I think we'll reach a sentence that will put the nail on the coffin of exactly where we're talking about, exactly which place in the world we're talking about, and how it got there. Of course, some of you have already noticed that they talked about 3,000 people and they talked about incense, but we haven't gotten there yet. For the father Min, lord of the foreign lands, on this august mountain, primordial one, foremost in the land of the horizon dwellers. So already you're seeing here a indication of what he's talking about. So primordial one, meaning the god of that land, foremost in the land of the horizon dwellers, meaning that these people sprang out from men, divine palace endowed with life. There you go. Divine nest of Horus, in which this god flourishes. And keep in mind, we're going to talk about it later, but Horus was worshipped in Ethiopia even after the Christian era, but we'll get back to that. His pure place of enjoyment above the countries of God's land. Okay, let's go back a bit. This is the part that I wanted to get to. So we'll read it one more time. Foremost in the land of the horizon dwellers, divine palace endowed with life, divine nest of Horus in which this god flourishes, his pure place of enjoyment above the countries of the god's land. Now keep that in mind. The place that he's talking about, that is the countries of Min, is the Sudanese regions, the borderlands, the lands that border Egypt, as they're right there, the horizon dwellers, the people who dwell on the horizon. And we know that he's talking about outside of their domain because he says Lord of the foreign lands. And then, of course, he mentions Horus. But the part that's important is these countries are above God's land. God's land, of course, being the land of Punt, to nature. As you can see, it's written in the original, well, not the original Egyptian, but the translation, the transliteration. So you see there, to nature, which is not how you would say it, but let's say it that way. To nature, God's land. So above the land of Punt. So they're saying you don't have to sail a sea or nothing, just above the land of the horizon dwellers. That's where you're gonna find the people in Punt. Now, you might think to yourself, isn't above Egypt? Well, we have to remember that the map was upside down, up was down, and down was up. And so that's how you get to it being above rather than below. In order to satisfy his spirit and to honor the God as he desires, as does a king who is on the great throne, foremost enduring of the monuments, excellent God, Lord of joy, much feared, greatly loved, heir of Horus in the two lands, reared by divine Isis, mother of Min, and Weret Hekau. Sorry for speeding past some of the others, but we're not doing a story on the gods. We're doing it on Punt, so let's focus on Punt. For the kingship of the banks of Horus, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nibtwar Wire, may he live like Ra forever, says my majesty sent the prince regent, leader of the city, vizier of overseer of works, royal confidant Amenemhat, together with an expedition of 10,000 men. So you see here, together with a mission of 10,000 men, started with 10,000 men from the southern province of Upper Egypt and from the south of Werbut to bring me a precious block of pure stone of this mountain. So, in other words, a trip was sent with 10,000 people to bring him a stone from this mountain whose excellence was made by men for a sarcophagus of an eternal memorial. I think that's self explanatory. And for monuments in the temples of Upper Egypt as a mission of the king, chief of the two lands, bring him his heart's desire from the lands of his father Min. So you can see here that when they're talking about Upper Egypt, this foreign land that they're talking about, the land of Min, is different than Upper Egypt, as you can tell. He created it at his monument for his father Min of Coptus, lord of the foreign lands, chief of the troglodytes. Let's stop there. These troglodytes would be those same people that they were trying to avoid. So troglodytes are Nubians who live in caves, as we have discussed when Herodotus talks about them. They live in caves, and these Nubians are foreigners inside Egypt. Some of them live high up inside of Egypt. And you can see there where he says, Lord of the foreign lands, chief of the troglodytes, that he may be given very much life. So far, there's too many clues about the fact that they're talking about the Nubian regions, they're talking about Punt in the word God's land, but there is still one more. And of course, there's that mission of the 10,000 people. And of course, if you weren't convinced by the fact that they've already mentioned or basically given us direction and given us a God who shows what type of people these people would be, which is why they're giving him to men, then we could continue to read this last piece. And live like Ra forever. Day 27, the lid of the sarcophagus descends. A block of 4 cubits by 8 cubits by 2 cubits, as it came from the works, calves were slaughtered, goats were sacrificed, incense, this incense is from, you'll see, put on fire, an expedition of 3,000 sailors from the provinces of Lower Egypt conducted it safely to Egypt. So, something here that is being talked about that I think is being missed a little bit is a lot of this is about the funeral of Mentuhotep II, but it's more about the coronation, but it's not the coronation because it's already in year 2, but it's more about the coronation of this person. So you can see how they're mixing two things together here. They're talking about, and they do this sometimes, they consider themselves the same as the king that came before. So they do talk about the other person, their father, as if they are the father and the son are one of the same. So let's read again. It says, calves were slaughtered, goats were sacrificed, incense was put on the fire. An expedition of 3,000 sailors from the province of Lower Egypt conducted it safely to Egypt. So again, the people who went to God's land, as we read before, there was 3,000 of them. They went, he said, I went and fetched some precious stones for you in the God's land, and this mission is being recounted here, and they're being used for a sarcophagus. Well, at least the lid of a sarcophagus in this case. So you can see here that there's a recount of the same information that existed prior, but of course, it shows you that the missions did not stop. The road to Punt did not stop during Amenhotep the Fourth's reign. I don't have any good pictures of Mentuhotep the Fourth, so I'll just use this one of the previous Mentuhotep. But I want to say something. There's something else that happened, and it might be as a result of this trip to Punt, because Mentuhotep the Fourth, right? So let's first go to Mentuhotep the Third. Mentuhotep the Third sent Henu to Punt, right? He sent Henu, and Henu came back, celebration, dot dot dot. Mentuhotep the Fourth sent Amenemhat to Punt, and guess who ended up on the throne? It seems as if Amenemhat, the person who went to Punt for the pharaoh, didn't exactly like being the runner for the pharaoh, and so he would take over after Mentuhotep took over, and with a possible assassination. So in this one, in the 10,000 expedition, Amenemhat traveled to Punt, and in the last one, in the recounting of the last one, in the last page, they recounted how in that happened in the previous. That's the follow up from the previous. So you can see here that the leader of the city, vizier, overseer of works, royal confidant Amenemhat, together with an expedition of 10,000 men, how he went to Punt. And of course, he was the Prince Regent, he was the next in line. But again, he must have not felt very satisfied with this position because there is a possible assassination to get to the throne quicker. And perhaps maybe even Nebtuawire or Nebtuawara, if that name is Ra, if he sensed that there might have been trouble, maybe that's why he sent the prince away so far away. So even though there were two missions, we can see here that the same places and the same things are taking place. Min, Coptus. We will need to draw a map later of which parts still belong to the Nubians and which part belong to the Egyptians, because they always seem to share Egypt. So we read from Wikipedia, it is assumed by some Egyptologists that Amenemhat either usurped the throne or assumed power after Mentuhotep the Fourth died childless. There is currently no archaeological or textual evidence to prove that Mentuhotep was deposed by his vizier or that he chose Amenemhat to be his designated successor. Perhaps either situation is possible, or another unknown one is nobody truly knows how Amenemhat I rose to the throne. Neither his mummy nor his burial place have been found. Okay, so let's talk about something. Amenemhat seems to have usurped the throne to me. It seems obvious, and I can tell why they assume it. But let's first read something that I disagree with Wikipedia. The text clearly says that he's the prince regent. Regent meaning co-ruler of Egypt. Prince meaning next in line, if possible. It's possible that Mentuhotep maybe couldn't have children and that he put someone who definitely, like a vizier, to be the next in line. And remember, it's not the first time that a vizier of Nubia would take over. That's what happened in the case of Ramses after Akhenaten. But the reason why some of them say this is because he died too early and he died childless and all of that. Now, it all depends what the circumstance is, but it's possible that he assassinated him. And why would it go to him anyway? Why would the power go to this person and not some other relative? So I'll finish by saying this, since we're already talking about the God's land. The job of the Pharaoh is to bring order amongst the chaos. And Mentuhotep the first had done this, or the second had done this. Mentuhotep the third maintained the power. Mentuhotep the fourth broke the dynasty, and Amenemhat was throwing Egypt back into chaos. I want to explore a video about exactly what was happening in 2000 BC in Ethiopia so that we can have a clue exactly what these people would have run into. And of course, where exactly were they quarrying these stones from? These precious stones. Because if you don't just cut stones and then leave, somewhere there's got to be a hole where they put the sarcophagus stone where they pulled it out from. And maybe we'll find it, maybe we won't. Now, we will be looking at stuff like this, and as you can see, there's a lot of similarities between this pottery found in Lake Tana in Ethiopia and the pottery that you see in the Nubian regions.